Hey there, and welcome back. If the day has worn you down, if your mind is still running over all the small worries it has gathered since morning, then let it slow now and let them go, because tonight we are going to lose ourselves in a story, a true one, the story of one extraordinary English family and the 6 remarkable sisters at the heart of it. Tonight is for anyone who has ever been drawn to a tale of sisters, of a house in the countryside, of a vanished world of privilege and wit and beauty, and of how the storms of a whole century can blow through a single family and scatter its children to the ends of the earth. I want to take you back to a green corner of England between the wars, into a nursery full of clever, difficult, dazzling girls, and then to follow them out into the world, one by one, as they become a beloved novelist, a great duchess, a runaway rebel, and 2 who would give their hearts to the most dangerous men in Europe. You need do nothing now but lie still and let me carry you back. And by the end of our evening together you will have followed all 6 of these sisters across the long arc of their lives, from a quiet manor house in Oxfordshire, to a drawing room in Berlin, to a prison cell in wartime London, to a magnificent house saved from ruin, and at the last to a small churchyard among the fields where 4 of them now lie side by side, beneath the same English sky under which they were born. Before we begin, let me say one quiet thing, and then I will leave you in peace for the rest of the night. If this is the kind of place you like to be taken, these slow journeys into worlds and lives that have slipped into the past, then you are always welcome to stay along for more of them. And these evenings will be the easier to find again on the nights when sleep is slow in coming. Nothing is asked of you, and there is no hurry in any of it. And if you feel like it, you might leave a few words below before you drift away, telling me where in the age you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you lie, a town, a country, the time upon your clock. I look through them more often than you would think, and there is something companionable in the picture they make, so many of us scattered over the dark, each in our own quiet room, all agreeing to spend a few hours together inside the same far-off story. You are part of that tonight, and now I will let it rest, and we can begin. Picture this. It is a soft grey afternoon in the English countryside, more than 100 years ago, and rain is falling gently on the fields and hedgerows of Oxfordshire, on the slow brown river winding through the water meadows, on the grey stone walls and the dripping woods. Set among those fields stands a rambling old manor house, its windows lit warm against the wet afternoon, smoke rising from its chimneys into the low sky, and inside, up under the roof, in a long nursery and schoolroom that smells of wood smoke and crayons and damp dog, there is a good deal of noise, for this is a house full of children, 6 girls and a boy, raised almost entirely within these walls, taught at home, left largely to one another's company, and busy at this very moment with the private games and jokes and feuds of a world they have built entirely for themselves. They do not know it yet, these children, but they will one day be among the most famous and the most infamous sisters in all of England. So let us climb the stairs toward that bright and noisy nursery, and meet the family that made them, and the strange enchanted world in which they grew. To understand the 6, you must first understand the world that made them, for it was an order already passing, even as they were born into it. And much of their story is the story of what happened to people raised for one age and flung into another. They came into being in the long golden afternoon of the English aristocracy, in the years on either side of the First War, into a class that still believed, more or less, that the ordered life it had always known would go on much as it always had. Theirs was a society of great country houses and London seasons, of land and rank and inherited certainty, of a settled hierarchy that reached from the labourer in the field up through the farmer and the parson and the squire to the old titled families at the top, each in his appointed place, each, it was assumed, content to stay there. The household itself was ancient, far older than its modest title suggested. The Mitfords traced their line back throughout the centuries to the time of the Norman conquest, to the wild border country of Northumberland in the far north of England, where their forebears had been among the rough-riding families who held the lawless frontier with Scotland. Over the long generations, the Mitfords had risen and settled and grown respectable, producing soldiers and scholars and servants of the crown, and by the time our story begins they held a barony, the title of Lord Redesdale, and the comfortable standing of the landed gentry. They were not among the very greatest families of the land, not dukes or great magnates with palaces and vast estates, but they were old and well connected, and entirely secure in their place near the top of English society, and that security shaped everything. It is hard now to recover quite how settled and confident that world felt to those born into it. A girl of this class grew up understanding, without ever being told, exactly who she was and what her life would hold. She would be raised in the country, taught the things a lady ought to know, and brought out into society at the proper age, presented at court, launched upon the round of balls and parties that was the marriage market of her kind. She would marry suitably a man of her own world. She would have children. She would take her place as the wife of a landed gentleman or a peer, running a great household, ordering the servants, doing good in the parish, and in time she would see her own daughters launched in their turn. The whole of a woman's life was mapped out before her, gently and firmly, and few thought to question the map. And yet beneath this settled surface the ground was already shifting. The First World War, which fell across the Six early childhood, tore a terrible hole through their class and their country, killing a generation of young men and shaking the old certainties as they had never been shaken before. The society that emerged from that war was a faster, harder, more uncertain place, hungry for change, restless and disillusioned, and into it the old aristocracy stumbled, bewildered, its confidence cracked, its income falling, its houses growing harder to keep. The girls in the Oxfordshire nursery were the children of the old order, raised in its assumptions and its certainties, but they would come of age in the new one, and the collision between the two would run all through their lives. That, in a sense, is the deepest theme of the whole Mitford story, and worth holding in your mind as we go. 6 girls raised for a settled, ordered, vanishing world, and let loose instead into one of the most turbulent and dangerous periods in all of human history. The very qualities their upbringing gave them, the boldness, the certainty, the conviction that they had every right to do exactly as they pleased, would carry them, in that turbulent age, to the most extraordinary and the most terrible places. But all of that lay ahead, for now they were simply children, in a house full of children, and to know them we must go into that house, and meet the 2 strange and formidable people at the head of it. Let us meet their parents, the figures the children called Favre and Mover. At the head of the family stood 2 of the most memorable parents in all of English life, so vivid that one of their daughters would later make them famous to the entire world, scarcely needing to change a thing. The father, David, the second Lord Redesdale, was known to his children simply as Favre, and he was a creature of the old country England, a tall, blue-eyed, hot-tempered man who loved his land and his fishing and his few simple pleasures, and viewed almost everything beyond them with deep and roaring suspicion. He had fought and been badly wounded in the First World War, lost a lung and a brother to it, and come home to a quieter life of country pursuits and fierce idiosyncratic opinions. He distrusted foreigners, distrusted most of his neighbours, distrusted anything new or clever or foreign-sounding, and expressed his many dislikes in sudden thunderous rages that terrified strangers and delighted his children, who learned to provoke and then enjoy them as a kind of domestic theatre. He was in truth both more frightening and more lovable than that makes him sound. Beneath the roaring, he was capable of great tenderness, devoted to his wife, fiercely protective of his daughters, and possessed of a wild, unconscious humour that his eldest girl would one day capture forever in her novels, where he appears, only lightly disguised, as a magnificently irascible old aristocrat who hunts his own children across the fields with bloodhounds for sport, and keeps an entrenching tool on the wall with which he claims to have killed Germans in the war. The portrait was affectionate and not entirely unfair. He was a man wholly of his own world, baffled and enraged by the modern age pressing in upon it, and his daughters loved him and feared him, and in time several of them broke his heart. Their mother, Sydney, whom the children called Mauve, was in almost every way her husband's opposite, and the contrast between them was one of the shaping forces of the children's lives. Where Favre was hot, she was cool. Where he raged, she drifted, calm and remote and faintly melancholy, moving through the noisy household with a dreamy detachment that her children found at once soothing and maddening. She was a handsome, capable, deeply self-contained woman, the daughter of a brilliant and eccentric father of her own, a member of Parliament, and a famous magazine man who had half raised her on a yacht and left her with a lifelong air of cool independence. She ran her large household with quiet efficiency and a set of firm and unusual convictions, distrusting doctors, believing the human body would heal itself if left alone, keeping to her own private theories about diet and health, and maintaining throughout a serene distance that some of her children later felt as a kind of coldness, a withholding of the warmth they craved. Between these two, the roaring father and the dreaming mother, the 7 children grew up in a household that was loving in its way and yet strangely sealed off from the wider world. The parents were suspicious of outside influences, of modern education, of clever or unsettling new ideas, and they drew their family inward, keeping the children close, schooling them at home, raising them in a tight and self-contained little kingdom over which Favre thundered and through which Mauve drifted. It was a happy home on the whole, full of jokes and energy and fierce family loyalty, but it was also an isolated one, an intense and inward world in which 6 clever, underoccupied, strong-willed girls were left largely to feed upon one another's company and upon their own restless imaginations, with little to test them against and little to channel the formidable energies their upbringing had given them. Niente. And that isolation, that inward intensity, would matter enormously. For when the wider world's fierce passions and ideologies came knocking, as they would in the turbulent decades ahead, these were young women with powerful convictions and no experience whatever of having them challenged, raised to believe in their own absolute right to think and do as they pleased. The household that Favre and Mauve had built to keep the world out would prove, in the end, no protection at all against the world's most dangerous ideas. But we are running ahead again. Let us go back into that sealed and happy kingdom while it was still happy and whole, and look more closely at the houses they grew up in, and the strange private realm the children made within them. Let us go up at last into the famous nursery, and the linen cupboard that became a kingdom of its own. The houses of the Mitford childhood were as much a part of the family legend as the people, and the children moved among several of them as the years passed. There was the great rambling pile they began in, too large and too costly to keep, and then the house that became the true home of their childhood, Ast Hall Manor, a beautiful old gabled house of grey Cotswold stone, set among the Oxfordshire fields beside the slow river Windrush, with its barns and its church and its village close by. And later there was the house their father built for the family nearby, at Swinbrook, a plainer, colder place that the children, with the merciless humour of the young, promptly nicknamed Swinebrook, and never loved as they had loved the older house. These were the settings of the whole drama, the warm old manor and the cold new one, the green valley the grey stone, the English fields and woods through which the children ran wild. At the heart of the children's world, though, was not any grand room, but a humble one, a linen cupboard, warm from the pipes that ran through it, where the women gathered to talk and plot and hide from the grown-ups. This warm cupboard became the headquarters of their secret society, and the very symbol of their closed little world, and around it grew up an entire private culture, dense with in-jokes and rituals and a peculiar shared language all their own. They called themselves and their intimates by a set of comic invented names. They spoke a nonsense tongue of their own devising, full of private words and silly voices. They kept up elaborate running jokes and teasing campaigns that could last for years. To be inside this world was to be wrapped in a fierce, funny, all-enveloping intimacy. To be outside it, as many a bewildered visitor discovered, was to feel oneself the butt of jokes one could not even understand. The children were educated, if that is the word, almost entirely at home, and herein lay one of the great grievances of their lives, at least for some of them. The single brother, as a boy, was sent away to school in the ordinary way of his class, but the girls were kept at home, taught by their mother, and by a succession of governesses, given a thin and patchy education, heavy on the things a lady was thought to need, French and music and deportment and a little history, and light on almost everything else. Some of them never forgave it. The cleverest among them burned with frustration at the learning they had been denied, at the universities their brother might attend, and they could not, at being raised as decorative creatures for the marriage market, when their minds hungered for so much more. That hunger, that sense of clever girls left idle and unstretched, would drive several of them, in time, to extraordinary lengths simply to escape. Today, for there was, beneath all the warmth and the laughter, a powerful undertow of boredom and longing in that sealed nursery world. These were exceptional girls, quick and bold and full of energy, and they were being raised for a narrow and decorative life in a corner of the country, with no school to channel their minds, no career open to them, no obvious future, but a good marriage. The closeness of the household was real and deep, and the childhood was in many ways idyllic, full of animals and freedom and the wild green countryside. But it was also confining, and as the girls grew toward womanhood, the confinement chafed, and each of them began, in her own way, to dream of the wider world beyond the grey stone walls, and to long for something larger to give herself to. They would each find that something, in the end. And the tragedy and the fascination of their story lies in how wildly, how dangerously, how unforgettably different the somethings turned out to be. So picture them in those last years of childhood, the 6 sisters and their brother running wild in the Oxfordshire fields, gathered in the warm cupboard, talking in their secret language, teasing and laughing and quarrelling, bound together by a love and a private world so intense that none of them would ever quite escape it, however far they roamed. They were, for this brief while, simply a family, whole and close and happy, before life and history, and their own fierce convictions began to pull them apart. Let us look now at who they were, these 7 children, one by one, beginning with the eldest, the sharpest, the funniest of them all, the one who would one day turn the Mitfords into literature. Let us meet Nancy. Nancy was the eldest, born in the autumn of 1904, and from the first she was the sharpest and the funniest of them all, blessed and cursed with a tongue that could charm a room or flay a victim, often in the same breath. As the firstborn, and for several years the only child, she had a confidence and a verbal brilliance the others never quite matched, and she used it without mercy, teasing her younger sisters to tears, inventing the cruel and clinging nicknames that followed some of them through life, ruling the nursery with a wit that was the keenest weapon in the house. There was something restless and unsatisfied in her, even as a girl, a quickness that found the narrow life of the schoolroom unbearable, a longing for a brighter and cleverer world than the one her upbringing offered her. She found it as soon as she could in London. As she grew into a woman in the 1920s, Nancy escaped the Oxfordshire countryside for the dazzle of the capital, and threw herself into the glittering, reckless social society of the young and fashionable, the set the newspapers loved to call the bright young things. Here at last was a world to match her wit, a whirl of parties and pranks and clever, brittle, amusing people, and Nancy shone in it, beautiful and sharp, and irresistibly funny, the life of every gathering. She had found her natural element, the company of the amusing and the smart, and she would spend much of her life in pursuit of it, for to Nancy boredom was the great enemy, and to be amused and amusing was very nearly the whole point of being alive. But beneath the sparkle there was sorrow, as there so often is with people who make a religion of being amusing. Nancy's heart was unlucky from the start. She spent years, her best early years, hopelessly devoted to a charming man who could never love her as she wished, his nature being what it was, and the long futile attachment wore at her and wasted her. And when at last she married in the early 1930s, she married on the rebound and married badly, a handsome, feckless, unfaithful man who brought her little but unhappiness, and from whom she would eventually, after long misery, be parted. The pattern of her life was set early, a brilliant, dazzling surface, all wit and laughter and sharp delight, laid over a deep vein of disappointment and unrequited longing that she bore, for the most part, with a courage disguised as flippancy. She had begun, too, to write. In between the parties and the heartbreaks, she discovered that she could turn her wit to paper, and she published her first light comic novels, sketches of the bright and foolish world she moved in, amusing and slight, and not yet the work she would one day produce. The writing was, at first, a way to make a little money, and to exercise the sharp eye and sharper tongue that were her great gifts. But it was also the beginning of the thing that would in the end make her name and outlast everything else about her. For Nancy was a born writer, an observer of the comedy of her own class and her own family, and she was quietly, all the while, storing up the material, the characters, the jokes, the whole rich, absurd realm of her childhood, that she would one day pour into the books that made her famous. That, though, was still some years away, and would come only after much more living and much more sorrow, and a war that would change everything. For now Nancy was simply the eldest, the family wit, dancing through the London of the bright young things with a breaking heart and a sharp word for everyone, the first of the women to escape the nursery into the wider world, and the one who would one day hold the entire family up to the light in her novels and fix them there forever. Around her, in those same dazzling years, gathered the rest of that glittering world, the age that her younger sisters would enter in their turn. Let us step into it for a moment, into the parties and the glamour and the gilded recklessness of the 1920s, the world of the bright young things. The age that Nancy danced into, and that her younger sisters would enter one by one as they came of age, was one of the strangest and most glittering moments in the social history of England, the brief, brilliant, slightly desperate gaiety of the 1920s. The Great War had ended, taking with it a generation of men and a whole age of certainty, and the people who came after were determined, it seemed, to dance upon the grave of the old order, to be modern and reckless and amusing, to throw off the heavy seriousness of their elders, and live for pleasure and sensation and the next clever party. The newspapers, half scandalized and half delighted, christened them the bright young things, and followed their antics with breathless attention. It was a whirl of endless parties, each more elaborate and outrageous than the last, of treasure hunts roaring through the night streets of London, of fancy dress balls and practical jokes and stunts designed to shock the older generation and fill the gossip columns. The young aristocrats and their friends, the clever, the rich, the beautiful, the merely fashionable, whirled through a perpetual round of amusement, dressing up, showing off, falling in and out of love, competing to be the most daring and the most diverting. There was real wit and real talent among them, writers and artists and genuine originals, alongside a great deal of brittle silliness and waste. It was glamour raised to a kind of frenzy, a determined, almost feverish gaiety, as though the entire generation were trying to outrun something it could not quite name. For the daughters of the aristocracy, this world was reached through the ancient ritual of coming out, the formal launching of a young lady into society around the age of 18. A girl would be presented at court, curtsying before the king and queen in the prescribed white gown, and then thrown into the social whirl of the London season, the round of balls and dinners and parties that ran through the summer months and existed, but beneath all its glamour, for a single serious purpose: to find her a husband. For a girl raised in the quiet of the country, this sudden plunge into the dazzle of society could be intoxicating or terrifying or both, and the Mitford sisters, as each reached the age, were duly brought out and launched upon it, blinking into the brilliant light. They were well suited to shine in it, most of them, for they had been given by their strange upbringing exactly the qualities the world prized. They were good-looking, high-spirited, supremely confident, and funny, with the easy assurance of girls who had never doubted their right to be exactly where they were. They had also, crucially, the family gift for being talked about, a flair for the dramatic and the outrageous that the gossip-hungry press adored. Almost from the moment they entered society, the Mitford girls were news, their beauty and their wit and their escapades filling the papers, and they took to fame as though born to it, which in a sense they were. The legend of the Mitford sisters, the dazzling, scandalous, irresistible Mitford girls, was beginning to form, and it would only grow. But the gaiety of the 1920s could not last, and beneath the parties the ground was already shifting towards something far darker. The decade ended in financial catastrophe, the great crash that threw the world into depression and want, and out of that hardship and fear there rose across Europe the harsh new political faiths that would tear the coming decade apart. The bright young things would not stay bright for long. The glittering world the girls entered as girls was the last careless flowering of the old order, and the storms that would scatter them were already gathering on the horizon. But before the storms broke, there was time for one of them to make a brilliant marriage and become the most admired beauty of her generation. Let us turn now to the third sister, the loveliest of them all, and the most fateful. Let us turn to Diana. Of all the sisters, Diana was the beauty, and her beauty was of a kind that stopped conversations and turned heads in the street, a cool, blonde, classical loveliness that everyone who met her remarked upon, and that no photograph quite captured. Born in the summer of 1910, the third of the daughters, she had grown into a young woman of such striking looks that she seemed to belong to a different order of being, and she knew it, and carried herself with the serene, untroubled confidence of someone who has never had to doubt her own power to charm. There was something almost unnerving in her composure, a stillness and certainty beneath the beauty that those who knew her best found both magnificent and, in time, rather chilling. She made at first exactly the brilliant marriage her beauty seemed to promise. While still only 18, she became engaged to a young man named Brian Guinness, heir to one of the great brewing fortunes and to a barony, a gentle, cultivated, adoring young man who could give her wealth and position and a life of cushioned ease. They married in 1929, when Diana was 19, in a grand society wedding that filled the papers, and they set up home as one of the golden couples of their generation, fabulously rich, beautiful, surrounded by the most amusing and artistic people of the day. They had houses in London and the country. They entertained lavishly. They gathered around them a brilliant circle of writers and painters and wits, among them the rising novelist Evelyn Waugh, who adored Diana and dedicated a book to her. To all appearances she had everything: youth, beauty, riches, a devoted husband, 2 small sons, and a place at the very heart of the glittering world. And yet it was not enough for her, and therein lay the seed of everything that followed. Diana was not a woman content with ease and admiration. There was in her a restlessness, an appetite for something larger and more intense, a will of extraordinary strength that the comfortable life of a rich young wife could not satisfy. She found her gentle husband, for all his devotion, a little dull. She found the golden life a little soft. She was waiting, though she may not have known it, for something to give that powerful will of hers to. And when it came, when she met the man who had become the cause and the deepest love of her life, she would throw away the entire golden world without a backward glance, with a coolness and a resolve that staggered everyone who knew her. For that is the thing one must understand about Diana, the quality that made her at once so formidable and so dangerous. She had a will of iron and a heart that, once given, was given absolutely and forever, and she possessed, beneath all her beauty and charm, very little of the ordinary capacity to doubt herself or to see her own choices from the outside. When she decided upon a course, she pursued it with a serene, unshakable conviction, indifferent to scandal, indifferent to the opinion of the world, indifferent even to the suffering of those she loved. It was a magnificent quality, in its way, and it would prove a catastrophic one, for it meant that when she gave her heart and her formidable loyalty to a cause that was wicked, she would follow it to the very end, and never, to the last day of her life, admit that she had been wrong. But all of that was still to come. For now, in the closing years of the 1920s, Diana was simply the loveliest of the Mitford sisters, the golden young wife at the centre of the brilliant set, seemingly the most fortunate of them all. The shadow had not yet fallen across her. To find where it came from, we must leave the dazzle of society for a while and look at the 2 quieter siblings, the ones who wanted no part of all this glitter, the gentle brother and the homely second sister, who only ever longed for the country and a quiet life. Let us turn to Tom and to Pamela. Oh, not all the children were drawn to the dazzle and the drama, and to know the family whole we must pause over the 2 who wanted least of it, the only brother and the second of them, the quiet ones at the still centre of all the noise. Tom, the single boy among the 6 girls born in 1909, was in many ways the golden child of the household, handsome and charming and gifted, adored by the others, and easy in the age in a way that none of the girls, for all their boldness, quite managed. He had the great advantage, denied to his sisters, of a proper education, sent away to school and given the schooling and the freedom that came to a boy of his class, and he grew into a cultivated, musical, enigmatic young man, a lover of books and of the piano, beloved by everyone, and fully known, perhaps, by no one. There was a shadow in Tom too, though, and it lay in his politics, for like 2 of his sisters he was drawn in the 1930s toward the harsh new faith rising in Germany, and came to hold sympathies that would, in the end, cost him dearly. He was the only son, the heir to the family's hopes, and his quiet attachment to the wrong side of the coming struggle would set him, when the storm finally broke, an impossible problem of conscience, one he could resolve only by a fateful choice and a soldier's death in a far country. But that reckoning lay years ahead, for now he was simply the golden brother, the still point at the centre of the sisters' gathering quarrels, loved alike by the rebel and the fascist and the wit, the one figure in the whole household whom nobody had any cause to resent. Pamela, the second sister, born in 1907, was the quietest and the least known of all the 6. the one the world has mostly forgotten, and she seems to have wanted it exactly so. Where the others craved the limelight, Pamela craved the country, and she spent her life in pursuit not of fame or love or political glory, but of a settled rural existence, of animals and gardens and good plain food. She was practical and capable and kind, the most domestic and least dramatic of the family, happiest among her chickens and her dogs and her horses, keeping house, cooking elaborate meals, asking nothing of the wider world, but to be left in peace with the things she loved. The others teased her for it, of course, as they teased one another for everything, but there was a steadiness in Pamela, a quiet contentment, that the more brilliant and tormented among them never found. Her life was not without its own quiet drama. The poet John Betjeman fell in love with her in their youth and asked her more than once to marry him, and she refused him, and married instead a brilliant and wealthy physicist, a clever, difficult man with whom she lived for some years before they parted. And in the later decades of her long life, she found her truest companionship not in marriage at all, but in the devoted friendship of an Italian horsewoman, with whom she shared her later years in the rural peace she had always wanted. She lived longer than most of her sisters, dying at last in the 1990s, the homely one, the country woman, the still point around whom the others had whirled, and there is something restful in her story, a reminder that not every member of even the most dramatic family need be dramatic, that there is a kind of wisdom in simply wanting an ordinary, peaceful, useful life. Tom and Pamela then were the quiet two, the gentle brother lost to the war, and the homely sister who outlived almost all the rest. They remind us that the famous Mitford drama, the fascism and the communism and the scandal, was not the entirety of the family, that alongside the ones who blazed and burned there were these others who only wanted the country and the company of those they loved. But that the drama was coming, all the same, gathering now as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s and the world darkened around them. The decade of glamour was ending. The decade of ideology was about to begin. Let us turn now to the moment the shadow first fell across this charmed family, the moment the wider world's great and terrible passions came knocking at the door. The turn from the 1920s into the 1930s was one of those moments when the whole mood of the world seems to change, when a bright and careless decade gives way to a dark and frightening one, and the change fell over the Mitford family with particular force, because it was precisely in these years that the elder sisters were coming into the full strength of their convictions. The gaiety of the 20s had ended in catastrophe, the great financial crash that began in America and spread throughout the globe, throwing millions out of work, ruining fortunes, and plunging the age into the long misery of the Depression. The dancing stopped. The mood turned anxious, angry, desperate, and out of that desperation, all across Europe, there rose the harsh new political faiths that promised to sweep away the failed old order and build something new in its place. These were the great rival ideologies of the age, communism on the one hand and fascism on the other, and they swept through the 1930s like fevers, claiming the passionate loyalty of millions, especially of the young, who looked at the wreckage of the old world and longed for something total and certain to believe in. In Russia, the communists had built their workers' state, and to its admirers it shone as the future of humanity, a society of equality and justice rising from the ashes of the old. In Italy and then, more terribly, in Germany, the fascists had seized power, promising national rebirth through strength and unity and the iron rule of a single leader. And to their admirers they too seemed to offer salvation, an answer to the chaos and weakness of the age. The two faiths hated each other above all things, and between them they would tear the decade, and in the end the world apart. It is hard, from our vantage, knowing all that we know of where these faiths led, to understand how intelligent and idealistic people could have given their hearts to them. But we must try to understand it, for it is the heart of the Mitford story, and the truth is that in the 1930s the full horror of what these movements would become was not yet visible to all, and their promise, their certainty, their air of youth and energy and historical destiny exerted a powerful pull. To young people raised in the tired, cracking old order, bored and idealistic and hungry for a cause, the great ideologies offered everything their comfortable lives had not: purpose, drama, belonging, the thrilling sense of being on the side of history. And the Mitford sisters, those clever, underoccupied, strong-willed girls raised to certainty and starved of any larger purpose, were exactly the kind of young people upon whom such faiths could take the deepest hold. And so it was that this single family, almost as though by some terrible experiment, divided itself along the great fault line of the age. The same childhood, the same nursery, the same parents and upbringing produced daughters who flung themselves to the very extremes of left and right, who came to hate each other's beliefs with a passion that strained and in some cases shattered the bonds between them. One sister would give her heart to fascism and to its British champion, another would become a fanatical devotee of the German dictator himself, a third would run away to the communists and spend her life on the far left, while the eldest looked on with mockery and dread, and the youngest and the quiet ones kept clear of it all. It was as if the whole vast political drama of the 20th century had been compressed into the quarrels of a single English family. This, then, is where our story darkens, and we must follow it into the darkness with honesty, neither flinching from what some of these women did and believed, nor pretending it was anything other than what it was. The choices that several of the six made in these years were not charming eccentricities. They were commitments to movements of real cruelty, and in the end to a regime that would carry out one of the greatest crimes in human history. We will not glamorize that, nor explain it away, but we will try to understand how it happened, how this gifted, privileged family came to be so terribly divided, beginning with the sister whose love affair carried her out of her golden age and into the heart of British fascism. Let us return to Diana and to the scandal that changed everything. The man who changed everything for Diana, and through her for the family, was Sir Oswald Mosley, and to understand what followed, you must understand what he was. He was a man of great charm and great ambition, and by most accounts, real personal magnetism, a gifted speaker who could hold a crowd in the palm of his hand. He had begun his political life full of promise, a young member of Parliament who had sat for both the great parties and seemed destined for high office. But he was vain and impatient and hungry for power on a scale the ordinary politics of his country could not give him, and in the early 1930s, amid the wreckage of the Depression, he abandoned the mainstream and founded a movement of his own, the British Union of Fascists, modelled openly on the fascist movements rising abroad, with their uniforms and their salutes and their cult of the leader. He meant to do in Britain what the dictators were doing on the continent, and Diana, when she met him, fell utterly under his spell. She met him while she was still married, still the golden young wife of her gentle Guinness husband, and she fell in love with a totality that swept everything else aside. It was not only the man she loved, though love him she did, with the fierce, absolute, lifelong devotion of which her formidable heart was capable. It was also his cause, his vision, his certainty. Here at last was the grand purpose her restless will had been waiting for, a man and a movement to which she could give herself entirely. And give herself she did, following him, as she later said without a trace of shame, absolutely and blindly. There was an obstacle, of course. Mosley already had a wife, a charming and well-loved woman, and he had no intention of giving her up, for he wished to keep both his wife and his beautiful young mistress. But Diana did not care. With a coolness that appalled even her own family, she left her husband, gave up her golden life, her position, her respectability, everything, and set herself up alone, a married woman who had abandoned her marriage to wait upon a man who would not marry her. The scandal was immense, and the cost to Diana was very real, for in the society of that time what she had done was close to unforgivable. She had broken every rule, thrown away every advantage, become an outcast from the respectable world she had reigned over. Her family was horrified. Her father, the roaring, conservative old Lord Redesdale, was beside himself with fury and grief, and forbade the household to receive the man he held responsible, referring to Moseley ever after with cold contempt. Her mother was wounded and bewildered. Even the others, for all their own boldness, were shaken by the sheer scale of what Diana had done, the icy completeness with which she had walked away from everything for the sake of this man and his cause. And yet none of it moved her in the slightest. She had made her choice, and she met the storm of disapproval with the same serene, unshakable composure with which she met everything, certain she was right, indifferent to the judgment of a world she now despised. In time the obstacle was removed, for Moseley's wife died, suddenly and young, and after a decent interval Diana at last became what she had given up so much to be, the wife of the leader of British fascism. They married, as we shall see, in circumstances that revealed exactly how far into the darkness her devotion had carried her. But even before that, the pattern of the rest of her life was set. She had bound herself, body and soul, to Moseley and to his movement, and she would remain bound to them, and to the larger and more terrible cause that stood behind them, for the whole of her life, through scandal and imprisonment and disgrace, never wavering, never doubting, never, to her dying day, admitting that the cause to which she had given herself was an evil one. This is the hard truth at the centre of Diana's story, and we must not soften it. She was beautiful and clever, and in many ways admirable in her courage and her constancy. Those who knew her spoke of her charm to the end. But she gave that beauty and that charm and that iron loyalty to the service of one of the cruelest political movements of the modern age, and through her friendships abroad, to which we will shortly come, she drew close to a regime that was even then preparing horrors almost beyond imagining. Her constancy, which in a better cause we might call a virtue, became in this one a kind of moral catastrophe, a refusal sustained across 70 years ever to look honestly at what she had served. And her path was about to grow darker still, for it led, by way of her strange, intense younger sister, all the way to Germany, and to the very heart of the coming evil. Let us turn now to that sister, the most troubling of them all. Let us turn to Unity. Unity is the hardest of the women to write about, and the most disturbing, for her story carries us closer to the heart of the century's darkness than any of the others, and there is in it a strangeness, a quality of obsession that is genuinely unsettling. She was born in 1914, in the very month the First World War began, the fifth daughter, and there clung to her from the start an air of the odd and the extreme. She was large where the others were dainty, awkward where they were graceful, given to violent enthusiasms and sudden strange behaviour, a misfit even within her own eccentric family. There was something in her that did not quite fit the world, a restlessness, an extremity, a hunger for the grand and the absolute, that the ordinary round of country life and London seasons could never begin to satisfy. There was, too, a kind of dark poetry in the very circumstances of her naming that hindsight cannot help but notice. By a strange chance, one of her middle names was Valkyrie, after the warrior maidens of the old Germanic legends, and she had been conceived, as it happened, in a remote Canadian town that bore a fateful name as well. None of this meant anything, Of course, mere coincidence. And yet, given where her life would lead, into the very mythology of Germanic darkness that the Nazis made their own, these accidents of naming have always seemed to those who tell her story like some grim joke of fate, as though she had been marked from birth for the role she would play. As a girl, she was a handful, naughty and attention-seeking and impossible to ignore, given to outrageous behaviour designed to shock. She kept pet snakes and rats, brought them into drawing rooms, behaved at her own coming out with a deliberate, defiant strangeness, stealing the writing paper at a grand court ball as a private joke. Beneath the clowning, though, was a real and dangerous emptiness, a craving for something enormous to fill her life, and when she found it, she would pursue it with a single-minded fanaticism that left even her own family frightened. For Unity was not a clever, ironic, self-aware creature like her eldest sister. She had little humour about herself, little capacity for doubt or distance. She was all appetite and conviction, and when she fixed upon a cause, she gave herself to it without reserve and without limit. The famous image of her childhood captures it perfectly, and it has become one of the defining pictures of the whole Mitford legend. For a time she shared a bedroom with her younger sister Jessica, and the two girls, already pulling toward the opposite poles of the age, divided their room down the middle with a chalk line, and decorated their two halves as little shrines to their rival faiths. On Jessica's side hung the symbols of communism, the hammer and sickle, the images of the workers' revolution. On Unity's side hung the symbols of the other extreme, the emblems and pictures of the rising German movement she was coming to worship. Two of them, one small room, the two great warring creeds of the century chalked out between them. It began, perhaps, as a children's game, a way of teasing and provoking, as the Mitfords always teased and provoked. But for these two it would become deadly serious, and the chalk line drawn across a nursery floor would widen, in the years to come, into a gulf that swallowed them both. It was Diana, already drawn into Mosley's fascist world, who opened the door for Unity into something larger and far more dangerous. The two sisters travelled together to Germany, and their Unity encountered for the first time the full spectacle of the Nazi movement at the height of its power, the rallies, the uniforms, the torchlight, the vast adoring crowds, the whole intoxicating theatre of the thing, and she was lost. Here was the enormous cause her empty, hungry heart had been craving. Here was the grandeur and the certainty and the belonging, and she gave herself to it with a totality that went beyond even Diana's. She resolved, with the fixed determination that was her one great gift, to make her way to the very centre of it, to the side of the man at its head. And against all probability, by sheer relentless will, she succeeded. Let us follow her then to Germany, and to the most disturbing chapter of the family's story. What Unity did next was extraordinary and chilling, and it must be told plainly. She set herself a single goal, to meet and to win the favour of the German dictator, and she pursued it with a patience and a cunning that would have been admirable in any better cause. She moved to Munich, the city the Nazis regarded as their spiritual home, and learned the language. And then she discovered the restaurant the dictator was in the habit of frequenting, and she began, day after day, week after week, simply to go there and sit, dressed and waiting, hoping to be noticed. For months she kept up this strange vigil, a tall, striking, foreign young woman, always there, always watching, until at last, in the winter of 1935, the man she had stalked so patiently took notice of her, and sent for her to come to his table. From that moment her fate was sealed. As she became, over the following years, a genuine member of the dictator's circle, one of the foreign admirers he liked to keep about him, and she met him many times, recording each meeting with the obsessive precision of the truly fixated. She was invited to the great rallies, seated among the honoured guests, drawn into the social realm of the Nazi leadership, and she revelled in it, intoxicated by her nearness to the man she worshipped as a god. To her family back in England, she sent rapturous accounts. In Germany, she became a familiar figure at the regime's grand occasions, and in Britain, she grew notorious, her name in the papers. The strange spectacle of an English aristocrat openly adoring the country's most dangerous enemy. She had achieved exactly what she set out to achieve. She had made herself the friend and the favourite of the most dangerous man in Europe. And here we must be entirely clear and refuse the temptation to make of Unity merely a tragic, deluded girl. She was deluded, and her story is in the end a tragic one. But she was also a willing and enthusiastic servant of a movement of pure evil, and she embraced its cruelty knowingly and without shame. She did not merely admire the pageantry and miss the horror. She shared the horror. She gave public voice to the regime's vicious hatred of the Jewish people, writing and speaking in support of persecution in terms so extreme that they shocked even some who knew her, lending her name and her aristocratic glamour to the propaganda of a regime that was, even as she dined at its tables, building the machinery of mass murder. There was no innocence in it. Whatever pity her eventual fate may rightly draw from us, we cannot and must not pretend that Unity was anything other than a true believer in a monstrous cause, complicit by her words and her presence in the evil she so adored. How a clever, privileged English girl could come to such a place is the question her story forces upon us, and there is no comfortable answer. Part of it lay in her own nature, that hungry emptiness, that craving for an absolute to give herself to, that lack of any saving humour or self-doubt. Part of it lay in her upbringing, the isolation, the certainty, the absence of any education or experience that might have armed her against such a seduction. And part of it lay simply in the terrible glamour of the thing itself, the spectacle and the certainty and the sense of historical destiny that drew so many lost and hungry young people of that decade toward the great totalitarian faiths. Unity was an extreme case, but she was not a unique one. She was one of many, across Europe, who looked into that darkness and saw, instead of horror, a kind of salvation. That is much of what makes her story so disturbing. It is not the story of a monster, but of an ordinary, damaged human being who gave herself to monstrous things. She could not have known, dining in her dictator's circle, in those last bright years of peace, how it would all end for her, how the very devotion that had carried her to the summit of her strange ambition would, when the world she had ignored finally crashed in upon her, destroy her utterly. That reckoning was coming, and we will come to it in its place, for it is one of the saddest passages in the entire family story. But first we must turn to the sister who stood at the very opposite pole from Unity, who had chalked out the other half of that childhood bedroom, and who was even now plotting her own dramatic escape, not toward the dictators, but toward the revolution that opposed them. Let us turn to Jessica, the rebel of the household, and to her flight. If Unity gave herself to the darkness of the right, her younger sister Jessica gave herself, with equal passion, to the cause that opposed it, and the two of them, who had divided that childhood bedroom with a chalk line, became living emblems of the great divide of their age. Jessica, known in the family by her nickname Decker, was born in 1917, the sixth of the 7 children, and from early girlhood she was the rebel, the one who looked at the privileged, sealed-off sphere of her family and found it not enchanting, but stifling, unjust, and faintly absurd. Where the others mostly accepted, however restlessly, the assumptions of their class, Jessica came to reject them root and branch, and turned her sharp Mitford intelligence and her considerable Mitford willfulness against the very world that had made her. She became, as a teenager, a convinced communist, drawn to the politics of the far left as fiercely as Unity was drawn to the far right, and for much the same underlying reasons: the boredom, the idealism, the hunger of a clever girl for a mighty cause, the longing to escape into something larger than the narrow life laid out for her. But where Unity's chosen faith led toward cruelty and tyranny, Jessica's, for all the terrible compromises of the movement she joined, sprang from a genuine revolt against injustice, a real sympathy for the poor and the oppressed, a true desire to set the crooked world straight. She read, she argued, she dreamed of revolution and of running away to join the great struggle, and she began, in secret, to plan her escape from the gilded cage of her upbringing, saving her money, biding her time, waiting for her chance to bolt. She had, like all the girls, the family wit and the family warmth, and these never left her, even at her most fiercely political. Indeed, one of the most engaging things about Jessica, all through her long and combative life, was that she never lost her sense of the absurd, never became a humorless ideologue, but kept always a sharp, mocking, irrepressible gaiety that made her wonderful company even to those who disagreed with everything she believed. She could laugh at herself, at her cause, at the whole human comedy, in a way that her tragic sister Unity never could, and that saving humour, that lightness, was perhaps what allowed her to give her life to a hard political faith without being hardened by it, to remain, beneath all the slogans, a warm and funny and deeply human woman. But as a young girl chafing in the Oxfordshire countryside, all of that lay ahead, and what consumed her was the single burning desire to get out, to escape her family and her class, and her stifling predetermined future, and to throw herself into the cause she had embraced. There was a marvellous comedy in her situation in those years, and she relished it even then. For outwardly she was simply another well-bred young lady being prepared for her coming out, fitted for her ball gowns, taught to curtsy, launched dutifully upon the marriage market like all her kind. And inwardly she was a convinced revolutionary reading forbidden books behind the drawing-room door, dreaming of the barricades, secretly putting aside what she called her running-away money against the day of her escape. She moved through the rituals of her class with a private, mocking detachment, a spy in the house of privilege, going through the motions of the debutante, while her heart was already somewhere else entirely, out among the workers and the rebels she had never met but had decided, with all the certainty of the young, to make her people. The double life suited her wit and her love of mischief, and she kept it up with relish, biding her time. She watched her sisters scatter, Nancy to her London wit, Diana to her scandal and her fascism, Unity to her dreadful German adventure, and she planned her own departure, longing for the moment when she too could break free and run toward the life she had chosen. That moment came when she fell in love, suddenly and completely, with a young man who embodied everything she dreamed of, a dashing, reckless, idealistic cousin who had already run away to fight in the great cause of the day. And with him, in one bold stroke, she made the most dramatic escape of all the girls. Let us follow her as she runs. The young man Jessica fell in love with was her own second cousin, Esmond Romilly, and he was, to a rebellious romantic girl, the most thrilling figure imaginable. He was a nephew by marriage of Winston Churchill himself, and so a child of the very establishment, but he had turned against it with a ferocity that matched Jessica's own. He had run away from his expensive school as a boy, taken refuge among the communists of London's East End, published a defiant little magazine attacking the whole system that had bred him, and then, still scarcely more than a boy, had gone off to Spain to fight against the fascists in the civil war that was tearing that country apart. He was reckless, brilliant, idealistic, and utterly fearless. And Jessica, who had been half in love with the idea of him for years before they ever met, lost her heart to him completely the moment they did. They met when he was recovering from an illness caught in the Spanish fighting, and within days they had formed a pact that was pure Jessica, pure romance and rebellion combined. They would run away together to Spain, to the war, to the cause, and leave the whole stifling world of family and class behind them forever. And so they did. With a daring that took the breath away, the young couple slipped out of England and made for the continent and the war, and Jessica, the rebel daughter, vanished from her family's world as completely as if she had stepped off the edge of the earth. To her parents it was a catastrophe, a beloved daughter run off to a foreign war with a penniless young revolutionary, and they reacted with all the frantic energy of a powerful family in crisis, pulling every string they could reach, appealing to the highest levels of the government, even in the end dispatching her eldest sister to track her down and bring her home. For the family actually sent Nancy, the eldest, out across the sea in pursuit, hoping that she might talk sense into the runaway and persuade her to return. It was a hopeless errand. Jessica had no intention whatever of coming back. She had escaped at last into the life she had dreamed of, and nothing on earth would have dragged her home again. The mission failed, as it was always going to fail, and the young couple held their ground, and in time, with the reluctant, defeated consent of their families, they married, and Jessica became Mrs. Romilly, a married woman of 19, an exile from her class, a communist, a wife, embarked upon the great adventure she had craved since girlhood. The break with her family was profound, and in some respects permanent. She had repudiated everything they stood for, run off in defiance of all their wishes, married against their will into a life of radical politics and genteel poverty. And though the bonds of family and the famous Mitford devotion were never quite severed, things could never be wholly as they had been. With one sister in particular, the gulf would prove unbridgeable, for between Jessica the communist and Diana the fascist there now opened a chasm of belief so wide and so bitter that the two would remain estranged, barely speaking, for the rest of their long lives, divided not by some petty family quarrel, but by the great murderous fault line of the century itself. The chalk line drawn across the nursery floor had become a wall between living sisters, and it would never come down. And so by the later 1930s the household stood scattered to the four winds of the age, each sister having chosen, or been claimed by, her own path. Nancy in London with her wit and her unhappy marriage, Pamela in the country with her animals, Diana bound to British fascism and to Mosley, Unity worshipping at the feet of the German dictator, Jessica gone to the communists and to America, Tom drawn quietly toward the right, and the youngest, Deborah, still a girl, watching it all unfold around her. One family, one childhood, and every great division of a divided century running straight through the middle of it. Let us pause here and look at that astonishing spectacle whole, the Mitfords at war with itself, before the wider war came to engulf them all. It is worth stopping, as the 1930s drew toward their terrible close, to contemplate the sheer strangeness of what had happened to this one family, for there has surely never been anything quite like it. Here were 6 girls and a brother, all raised in the same nursery, taught by the same governesses, shaped by the same roaring father and the same dreaming mother, and they had scattered themselves over the entire political universe of their age, from the furthest left to the furthest right, with every shade between. A journalist of the day summed them up in a phrase that has stuck ever since, naming them off like a grim nursery rhyme. The novelist, the countrywoman, the fascist, the Hitler worshipper, the communist, and the duchess-to-be. It reads almost like a joke, and the family themselves, with their irrepressible humour, sometimes treated it as one. But it was no joke. It was the great tragedy of their century, played out in miniature within a single family, and it cost them dearly. The divisions were real, and some of them were savage. Between the two of them at the extremes, the fascist and the communist, there fell a silence that would last, with the briefest of exceptions, until death. The eldest sister, watching the other's politics with a mixture of mockery and genuine alarm, went so far as to satirize the fascists in a novel, wounding the others deeply, and later, when war came, would do something graver still, quietly informing the authorities of her own sister's dangerous loyalties. The household itself was torn apart by it all. Even the parents fell out, the father and the mother coming to differ bitterly over the German question and the daughter's choices, their marriage strained at last by the same divisions that split their children. The sealed, happy nursery kingdom of the early years had become a house divided against itself. Its members ranged on opposite sides of the great quarrel of the age. And yet, and this is one of the most striking and human things about the story, the love did not die. Beneath all the bitter division, the bonds of family and childhood proved astonishingly tough, and the women went on loving one another even as they hated one another's beliefs, went on writing to one another, joking with one another in their private language, caring for each other in trouble, with a warmth that crossed even the deepest political chasms. They were, to the end, a family, bound by the fierce intimacy of that shared and singular upbringing, and the spectacle of their continued love across such divisions is in its way as remarkable as the divisions themselves. It is possible, their story seems to say, to love people whose beliefs you find monstrous, difficult, painful, sometimes impossible to sustain, but possible, and the Mitfords lived out that hard truth more fully than almost anyone. Caught in the middle of it all were the youngest and the parents, the ones who had not chosen extremes. Deborah, the baby of the family, still only a child and then a girl through much of this, looked on at her elders' fierce quarrels with a quiet, watchful detachment, drawn neither to the one side nor to the other, wanting only, it seems, to stay clear of the wreckage and to make a calm and settled life of her own. And the parents, bewildered and grieving, tried and failed to hold their splintering family together, looking on in helpless sorrow as the children they had raised in such love and such certainty followed, that certainty clean off the edge of the known world, into causes and countries they could neither share nor begin to understand. This, then, was the family on the eve of the war, scattered, divided, famous and infamous, bound by love and split by belief, a single household holding within it the whole vast struggle that was about to consume the age. And now that struggle came. The long slide toward catastrophe that had run all through the decade reached its end, and in the autumn of 1939, the war that everyone had feared and many had courted broke at last over Europe. For most families, it was a calamity. For this family, their daughters bound body and soul to the very enemy their country now faced, it was something stranger and more terrible still. Let us turn to the coming of the war, and to what it did to the Mitfords. When the war came at last in the first days of September 1939, it fell upon the Mitford family with a peculiar and dreadful weight, for no other family in England, perhaps, stood so cruelly exposed to it. For most people, the outbreak of war was a national calamity, a matter of fear and grief and grim resolve, but it was at least a calamity faced together, the country united against a common enemy. For the Mitfords, it was something far stranger and more agonizing, because the enemy their country now faced was, for two of the six, not an enemy at all, but the very object of their deepest love and loyalty. The nation went to war against Germany, and within this one family, two daughters had given their hearts to Germany and its leader, and a third was bound in marriage to the man who led the movement that openly admired him. Consider the impossible position in which each of them now stood. Diana was the wife of the leader of British fascism, a movement now suspect and despised, its loyalties to the enemy a matter of grave public suspicion, and she and her husband became at once objects of national hostility and official watchfulness. Unity was actually in Germany, in the dictator's own circle, when her homeland declared war upon the country and the man she worshipped, caught on the wrong side of a line that had suddenly become a chasm, her two great loyalties, to her homeland and to her idol, torn violently apart. Even the brother Tom, drawn toward the German cause, found himself unable to reconcile his sympathies with the duty his nation now demanded, and would resolve the conflict only by choosing to fight in a different theatre of the war altogether. The great political passions the women had embraced in the abstract had now become brutally, inescapably real. For the rest of the household, those who had not chosen the extremes, the war brought its own torments. The parents watched in anguish as the loyalties of their children collided head-on with the survival of their country. The eldest, working in London, threw herself onto the side of her nation without hesitation, and would even, as the danger grew, take the painful step of warning the authorities about her own sister's husband and his network, judging the threat too grave for family feeling to stand in the way. The youngest sister was swept up, like millions of others, into the ordinary upheavals of wartime. The household was wrenched apart, scattered throughout the lines of a conflict that ran not only between nations, but straight through their own kitchen and drawing room, setting sister against sister, loyalty against loyalty, in ways that no family should ever have to endure. There was, too, a peculiar public dimension to the family's ordeal, for the Mitfords were famous, and their divided loyalties were known to all, and so they faced the war not only with private anguish, but under the hostile gaze of a whole watching nation. The newspapers that had once delighted in the glamour of the Six now eyed them with suspicion, and the family name, once a byword for wit and beauty, became in some quarters a byword for treachery, for sympathy with the enemy at the gates. To be a Mitford in those first grim months of the war was to be watched, distrusted, talked about, the family's intimate divisions exposed to the judgment of strangers, and the strain of that public suspicion fell upon all of them, the guilty and the innocent alike, the loyal eldest sister and the apolitical youngest, no less than the two who had truly given their hearts to the foe. The war that divided the family also exposed it, mercilessly, to a country in no mood for mercy, and at the very heart of it, in those first terrible days, stood the figure of Unity, alone in Germany, facing the collapse of her entire world. Everything she had built her life upon, the friendship with the dictator, the dream of an alliance between her country and his, the whole intoxicating fantasy of her years in Germany, was destroyed in an instant by the declaration of war. The two halves of her divided heart, her love of England and her worship of Germany, could no longer both be held. They had been set at war with each other, and the strain of it, upon a mind already unstable, and a nature already given to extremity, proved more than she could bear. What happened to Unity in those first days of the war is the saddest passage in the household's history, and it must be told gently and with restraint. Let us turn to it now. When the war broke and her two worlds were torn apart, Unity could not survive the breaking. On the very day her country declared war upon the Germany she had given her life to adoring, alone in Munich, her whole reason for living destroyed, she attempted to take her own life. She did not die, but she was gravely and permanently injured, and she never truly recovered, and the brilliant, fanatical, impossible girl who had stalked a dictator across a continent was, from that day, effectively gone. What remained was a damaged and diminished shadow of her, and the long, sad aftermath of her great delusion would stretch out for years. The story of how she was brought home is one of the most affecting in the entire family's history, and it shows, beneath all the politics and the horror, the simple persistence of family love. Word reached England that Unity was gravely hurt and being cared for in Germany, and as the situation grew impossible, arrangements were made through neutral Switzerland for her family to recover her. Her mother and her younger sister travelled out across a continent at war to fetch her, and what they found shocked them beyond words. For the Unity they brought home was a stranger, altered almost past recognition, unable to walk properly, struggling to speak. Her personality changed, a person who had to be cared for like a child. The fierce, frightening, larger-than-life sister was gone, and in her place was this broken creature whom they carried gently back across the sea to England, every jolt of the long journey a fresh agony to her. She lived on for some years more, tended by her devoted mother, a diminished and dependent figure, the old fire and fanaticism extinguished, much of her former self simply absent. There is a terrible irony in it that the Mitfords must have felt keenly. The sister who had given herself to a movement that despised weakness and worshipped strength was now utterly helpless, reduced to a kind of second childhood, wholly reliant on the patient care of the family she had once scandalized. She lingered thus, slowly failing until the wound that had never truly healed at last carried her off, and she died in the spring of 1948, at the age of 33, the second of the siblings to be lost. And surely the most tragic. What are we to make of Unity, looking back? She is the hardest of all the girls to feel about, for she gave herself, knowingly and ardently, to a monstrous cause, and we cannot and should not wish away the things she said and believed and lent her name to. And yet her end was so pitiable, the destruction of her so complete, the spectacle of that damaged shadow tended by her grieving mother so sorrowful, that it is hard in the end to withhold all compassion. She was a human being, gravely damaged in spirit, long before she was damaged in body, who gave her whole self to a terrible illusion and was destroyed by it utterly. Her story is a warning, perhaps, of what can happen when a hungry, ungoverned heart fixes upon a false and cruel God. It offers everything, and in the end it takes everything, and leaves only ruin. Let us leave Unity now gently to her rest, and turn to the sister whose loyalty to the same dark cause did not destroy her, but did cost her years of her freedom. Let us turn to Diana, and to her imprisonment. Diana's war was spent for the most part behind the walls of a prison, and to understand why, we must go back a few years, to the event that revealed exactly how far her devotion to the fascist cause had carried her. In the autumn of 1936, after the death of Mosley's first wife had at last left him free, Diana married him. But she married him not in England quietly, as a chastened divorcee might, but in Germany, in secret, in the Berlin drawing room of one of the most senior figures of the Nazi regime, the dictator's own propaganda chief, with the dictator himself present as the guest of honour. It is an almost unbelievable scene to contemplate. An English aristocrat marrying the leader of British fascism in the home of a man who would become one of the chief architects of mass murder, blessed by the presence of the tyrant whose regime was even then building its machinery of persecution. The marriage was kept secret for 2 years, and Diana moved freely in the highest circles of the regime, a friend of its leaders, a guest at its great occasions, entirely at home in the company of monsters. When war came then, the British government had every reason to regard Diana and her husband as a genuine danger. Here were the leader of British fascism and his wife, she personally intimate with the enemy's leadership, he the head of a movement openly sympathetic to the foe, at a moment when Britain stood in mortal peril and feared invasion and betrayal from within. And so, Under the emergency regulations that allowed the wartime government to detain those it judged a threat to the realm without charge and without trial, both Musleys were arrested and imprisoned. Diana was taken in the summer of 1940, only weeks after the birth of her fourth son, torn away from her newborn baby and her other small children, and shut up in a grim London prison, where she would remain, for the most part, for more than 3 years. The conditions of her imprisonment have been much discussed, and there is a bitter irony in them that her critics have never failed to point out. For Diana, even in prison, remained an aristocrat with powerful connections, and in time, after the intervention of the Prime Minister himself, who happened to be related to the family by marriage, she and her husband were permitted to be held together in a small house within the prison grounds, where they kept a garden, cooked their own meals, and lived in a relative comfort that the ordinary prisoners around them could only dream of. The woman who had befriended the architects of the concentration camps complained of the dirt and discomfort of an English prison. The contrast was not lost on her contemporaries, and has not been lost on history. After more than 3 years they were released, on grounds of her husband's failing health, to a storm of public protest, and saw out the rest of the war under guard in the countryside, watched, despised, but free. Through all of it, Diana never bent and never broke and never, for a single moment, admitted that she had been wrong. She bore her imprisonment with the same serene, unshakable composure she brought to everything, regarding herself not as a criminal, but as a martyr, a victim of injustice, persecuted for her loyalty to her husband and her beliefs. And when it was over, and the war was won, and the full, unbearable truth of what the regime she had loved had done was laid bare before the entire world, the camps, the murders, the vast machinery of genocide, even then she did not waver. She lived on for nearly 60 more years, mostly in France, charming, cultivated, unrepentant, the friend of the disgraced and the exiled, and to the very end of her long life she defended the indefensible, made light of the unforgivable, and refused, with that same magnificent and terrible constancy, ever to look honestly at what she had served. It is this, more than the fascism itself, that makes Diana so chilling a figure and so instructive a one. There were many in that decade who were seduced for a time by the dark faiths of the age, and many who, when the truth came out, were appalled at what they had nearly embraced, and turned away in horror and shame. Diana was not among them. She had the courage of her convictions, and she had the constancy, and she had the charm, and she turned them all to the defence of evil, and never repented. She reminds us that loyalty and courage and steadfastness, those qualities we rightly admire, are only as good as the cause they serve, and that given to a wicked cause they become not virtues but their opposite. Let us leave Diana to her long, unrepentant exile, and turn back to the family she left behind, and to the war that was even now taking from them the one they all loved best. While 2 of the women were bound up with the enemy, the eldest threw herself wholeheartedly into her country's war, and Nancy's years in wartime London show us another face of the household altogether. She remained in the capital through the worst of it, through the long nights of the bombing when the German aircraft came over, and the city burned, and she worked and helped where she could, taking in refugees fleeing the terror on the continent, doing her bit with the brisk, unsentimental courage that the war drew out of so many. In time she found a place that suited her perfectly, a celebrated little bookshop in the heart of fashionable London, and there, among the books and the writers and the literary gossip she loved, she passed much of the war, presiding over the shop, holding court, the witty centre of a brilliant circle even amid the rubble and the rationing. But the war brought Nancy private sorrow as well, the deepest of her life. Her unhappy marriage had all but collapsed, and in these years she suffered a personal tragedy that closed off forever the possibility of the children she had longed for, a wound she bore, as she bore all her wounds, behind a screen of jokes and gaiety, never letting the world see how deep it went. And it was in the midst of all this, in the darkest stretch of the war, that she met the man who would become the great love of her life, the dashing French officer attached to the Free French forces in London, and I lost her heart to him as completely and as hopelessly as she had lost it to anyone, beginning the long, devoted, largely unrequited attachment that would shape the whole of her remaining life. Out of all this, the war, the bombing, the sorrow, the hopeless love, she would shortly draw the material for the books that made her immortal, but that flowering still lay just ahead. For the Mitfords as a whole, the great wound of the war was the loss of the brother. Tom, unable to bring himself to fight against the Germany he had admired, had gone instead to the war in the Far East, and there, in the brutal jungle fighting against the Japanese in the spring of 1945, with victory in Europe only days away and the long nightmare almost over, he was killed. He was 36. Of all the blows the family suffered, this was the heaviest, for Tom was the one they had all loved without reservation or division, the golden brother who stood outside the bitter quarrels of his sisters, and his death united them all, fascist and communist and novelist and duchess alike, in a single common grief. The war that had set the six against one another took from all of them, equally, the brother they shared. The parents, too, were broken by these years, their long marriage and their old certainties alike shattered by all that had befallen their children. The roaring father and the dreaming mother had differed bitterly over the German question and the fate of their daughters, and the strain proved more than even their long union could bear. In effect, they parted, living increasingly separate lives, the old man retreating into a lonely, diminished existence, much of it on a remote island, the family owned in the Scottish seas, a baffled and broken figure, far from the confident patriarch who had roared through the nursery years. The mother, more steadfast, took on the sad, patient duty of caring for her broken daughter Unity through her diminished final years, and bore the family's many sorrows with her old remote composure. The sealed and happy kingdom of the early chapters was gone for good, dissolved by war and grief and the terrible divisions of the age. And so the war ended, at last, in victory and exhaustion and the slow uncovering of horrors that put all the household's quarrels into a new and dreadful light. The society that emerged was utterly changed. The old aristocratic England the women had been born into swept further than ever toward its end, and the surviving Mitfords, scattered and wounded, had now to make their way in this altered world, each according to her nature and her fate. Some would flourish in the years ahead, some would dwindle, some would reinvent themselves entirely. The drama of their youth was over, the long aftermath was beginning. Let us follow them into it, and see what the rest of their lives would make of these extraordinary women, beginning with the eldest, who was about to find, at last, in the wreckage of her hopes, her truest gift. Let us follow Nancy to Paris. After the war, Nancy did the thing that defined the rest of her life. She moved to Paris, to be near the Frenchman she loved. And there, in the city, she came to adore. She found at last the flowering of her great gift and the bittersweet shape of her mature years. She had loved France and the French all her life, and Paris suited her as London never quite had, and she settled into a charming apartment on the left bank, and built around herself the kind of life she had always wanted, full of wit and elegance and amusing company, the celebrated English writer at the heart of a brilliant Parisian world. At the centre of it, always, was her devotion to her Frenchman, the great unrequited love of her life, who valued her company and her wit and her friendship, but never returned her passion as she longed for him to, so that her Parisian happiness was always shadowed by a private, unhealing sorrow. But out of that very sorrow, and out of the rich material of her own family and childhood, came the books that made her name and have kept it alive ever since. Just after the war, she published the novel that changed everything, a sparkling, tender, autobiographical comedy of an eccentric aristocratic English family very like her own, presided over by a roaring, hilarious father, unmistakably modelled on her own. It was an immense success, a bestseller that made her famous, and for the first time financially free, and she followed it with a companion novel, equally beloved, in the same enchanting vein. In these books, Nancy did at last what she had been preparing to do all her life. She turned the whole strange, funny, painful world of her upbringing into literature, fixing her family and her vanished childhood forever in prose of such wit and lightness and underlying feeling that readers have loved them ever since. The roaring father, the dreaming mother, the pack of clever sisters, the great cold house, the whole Mitford world lives on most vividly of all in the pages Nancy made of it. She became, in her Paris years, a figure of real celebrity and real influence, her wit sought after, her opinions quoted, her every book awaited. She wrote a teasing little essay on the speech and manners of the English upper classes, distinguishing the words and habits that marked one as truly of the aristocracy from those that betrayed a humbler origin, and it caused a sensation quite out of proportion to its lightness, setting the entire country anxiously examining its own vocabulary and fixing Nancy in the public mind as the great authority on the subtleties of class. And she turned, too, in her later years to history, producing a series of elegant, witty, hugely popular biographies of the great figures of the French past, the kings and courtiers and mistresses of old France, written with the same lightness and the same sharp eye that animated her novels, and read with delight by a vast audience. Yet for all the success and the celebrity, the sadness never quite lifted. The deepest love of her life remained always just beyond her reach, and in time he wounded her deeply by marrying another woman, a blow from which she never fully recovered. And then, in her last years, her health failed, and she was overtaken by a cruel and painful illness that tormented her for a long time before the end. An illness she bore, characteristically, with enormous courage and a steady flow of jokes, refusing to the last to let the world see her suffer, hiding her pain as she had always hidden her sorrows behind the bright, unbreakable surface of her wit. She died at her home near Paris in the summer of 1973, the first of the sisters to go, and her ashes were brought home to England and laid to rest in the quiet churchyard of the village where she had grown up, among the Oxfordshire fields beneath a stone marked at her own wish with a small carved mole, a private family joke kept up even unto death. Nancy's life, when you stand back from it, has a shape both triumphant and sad. The clever, unhappy girl who turned her unhappiness into art, who never won the love she most wanted, who never had the children she longed for, but who left behind, out of all that disappointment, books that have given delight to millions and have kept her whole lost world alive. She is, in a sense, the one who redeemed the Mitfords, the one who took all its strangeness and sorrow and division and made of it something beautiful and lasting. And she is our guide in the end to the others, for it is largely through Nancy's loving, mocking, immortalizing eye that the world has come to know the Mitfords at all. Let us turn now to the sister who stood furthest from Nancy in every way save talent, the rebel who had run away to the revolution and who was building, across the ocean, a remarkable life of her own. Let us follow Jessica to America. Jessica's path led not to Paris but to America, and to a life as different from the others as it is possible to imagine, a life of radical politics, hard work, and reinvention an ocean away from everything she had been born to. She and her young husband had crossed to the United States just before the war, seeking a new world far from the old one they had rejected, and they had begun to build a life there together when the war reached out and took him from her. For her husband, the reckless idealist, had gone off to fight, joining the air forces of the Allied cause, and in the winter of 1941, his aircraft was lost over the cold northern sea, and Jessica, not yet 25, found herself a widow in a foreign country with a small daughter to raise and almost nothing to her name. It was the great tragedy of her early life, the loss of the dashing cousin she had run away with, the partner of her grand rebellion, and it might have broken a lesser spirit. It did not break Jessica. She stayed in America, made her own way, found work, and in time found love again, marrying a clever, principled American lawyer who shared her politics and her passion for justice, and with whom she would spend the rest of her life. Together, they threw themselves into the radical politics of their adopted country, joining the communist movement, campaigning for the rights of working people, and above all, for the rights of the persecuted black population of America, throwing themselves into the long, dangerous, unglamorous struggle for civil rights decades before it became a famous cause. These were perilous years to hold such views in America, the years when the country was gripped by a great fear of communism and hunted suspected radicals with vindictive zeal, and Jessica and her husband were hauled before the inquisitors and harassed for their beliefs. But Jessica, with the unbreakable Mitford nerve, gave not an inch, facing down the persecution with the same defiant, mocking courage with which she had once faced down her own family. In time, she and her husband grew disillusioned with the communist movement itself, as the crimes of the Soviet regime became undeniable even to its sympathizers, and they left the party. But Jessica never abandoned the deeper convictions beneath it, the hatred of injustice, the sympathy for the underdog, the fierce egalitarian passion that had driven her from the start. She simply found new ways to fight, and the most powerful of them turned out to be the family gift she had carried with her all along. She could write. Late in her life, almost by accident, Jessica discovered that she possessed, like her eldest sister, a brilliant pen, and she turned it into a weapon, becoming one of the great campaigning journalists of her age, a fearless exposer of cruelty and humbug wherever she found it. Her most famous book took aim at an unlikely target, the American funeral industry, whose practices of preying upon the grief of the bereaved to sell them lavish and needless funerals she exposed with such wit and savage clarity that the book became a sensation, a runaway bestseller that genuinely changed the industry it attacked. It was a perfect expression of everything Jessica was, the sharp eye for cant and exploitation, the gleeful demolition of the pompous and the dishonest, the deadly seriousness of purpose wrapped in irresistible comedy. She wrote other books too, including a celebrated memoir of her own extraordinary upbringing that introduced the whole Mitford legend to a new generation, and she became, in her American exile, a beloved and formidable public figure, the rebel who had made herself, by sheer talent and nerve, into a force to be reckoned with. Through it all she kept the family wit, the saving Mitford humour, sharper in her perhaps than in any of them save Nancy. She never grew solemn or self-important, never lost the ability to laugh at herself and at the whole human comedy, and even her death she met with the same irreverence she had brought to everything, arranging her own affairs with a final mischievous joke at the expense of the very funeral industry she had spent her life attacking. She died in America in the summer of 1996, the rebel to the last, having lived a life utterly unlike anything her birth had seemed to promise, a life of struggle and conviction and laughter, lived entirely on her own fierce terms. And yet, for all the distance she had put between herself and her family, The old bonds never wholly broke save one. She remained close, by a lifetime of letters, to most of the others across all the miles and all the years, writing to them in the old private language, joking with them, loving them across every divide. But with one sister there was no reconciliation and could be none. From the one who had taken the opposite road, who had given her heart to the far right while Jessica gave hers to the far left, she remained utterly cut off, the two of them locked in a coldness that would last almost the whole length of their lives. We will come, before the night is done, to the full sorrow of that breach, and to the single brief moment, late and in grief, when it was briefly set aside. For now it is enough to say that of all the ties that held this family across its quarrels, this was the one the age broke clean through, and never mended. Let us turn now to the youngest of all, the one who kept clear of the bitter quarrels, and who would outlive every one of them. Let us turn to Deborah. Deborah was the baby of the family, born in 1920, the last of the six, and she grew up watching her glamorous, terrifying elder sisters blaze off toward their various extraordinary destinies, and she drew from the spectacle a quiet, sensible, lifelong conclusion that she wanted no part of any of it. While the others embraced the causes of the age, ran away to revolutions, worshipped dictators, and tore the household apart with their convictions, Deborah looked on with a child's clear eye and resolved, it seems, simply to be happy, to keep clear of the politics that was destroying her family, and to make for herself a good, ordinary, useful life. It was the least dramatic choice any of the girls made, and in the long run it was perhaps the wisest. For Deborah, the unremarkable one, the one her clever sisters teased for being slow, would end by living the longest, the steadiest, and in many ways the most genuinely successful life of them all. She had her own brush with the family's dark glamour, it is true. As a girl she had once, with her mother and her doomed sister Unity, even taken tea with the German dictator, an encounter she would later recall with brisk, unsentimental dismissiveness, refusing all her life to make either too much or too little of it, but it left no mark upon her. She had no taste for ideology, no hunger for grand causes, none of the dangerous idealism that drove her sisters to such lengths. What she wanted was a home, a family, a place in the settled world, and she set about getting it with the same quiet capability that would mark her life. In the middle of the war she married a young aristocrat named Andrew Cavendish, the second son of the Duke of Devonshire, a charming, clever, troubled man who was not, as a younger son, expected to inherit his father's great title and estates. They married for love, in wartime a young couple with modest prospects, and Deborah seemed set for the pleasant but unexceptional life of an aristocratic younger son's wife. But fate, which had dealt so strangely with all the girls, had a great destiny in store for the youngest as well, though hers would come not through her own dramatic choices, but through a series of deaths that placed upon her shoulders one of the grandest positions in all of England. For her husband's elder brother, the heir to the dukedom, was killed in the war, in the fighting that followed the great Allied landings, leaving Andrew suddenly and unexpectedly the heir to the whole vast Devonshire inheritance. And then, a few years after the war, the old Duke died, and Andrew succeeded him, and Deborah, the baby of the Mitford family, the one who had wanted only an ordinary life, found herself transformed into the Duchess of Devonshire, mistress of one of the greatest aristocratic houses in the kingdom, with all its lands and treasures and crushing responsibilities. It was a staggering elevation, and it came wrapped in difficulty, for the old Duke's death brought with it a ruinous burden of death duties, the enormous taxes that fell upon a large estate when it passed from one generation to the next, taxes so vast that they threatened to break up the whole inheritance and bring the vast house itself to ruin. And here Deborah found her calling, and showed the age the steel beneath her quiet, modest surface. For the palatial house at the centre of the inheritance, one of the most magnificent in all of England, was in serious peril, weighed down by debt and taxes, and the costs of an age that had little use for such places, and saving it would take decades of hard, clever, determined work. Deborah took up that task and made it her life's work, and in doing so she revealed herself to be the most formidable businesswoman of all the six, a brilliant, practical, tireless manager who would, against all the odds, not merely save the great house but make it thrive. The youngest, slowest, least regarded of the women was about to become the saviour of one of England's greatest treasures. Let us follow her to that house, and to the work that made her name. Let us go to Chatsworth. The house was called Chatsworth, and it was, and is, one of the wonders of England, a vast and palatial seat set in a green valley among the hills of Derbyshire, the home of the Devonshire family for centuries, filled with one of the greatest private art collections in the world, surrounded by famous gardens and a great park. When Deborah and her husband took it on, it was in trouble, half shut up, drained by the costs of the age and the heavy taxes that had fallen upon it, the kind of enormous, beautiful, impossible house that all over the country in those years was being abandoned, demolished, or handed over in despair. The whole way of life that had sustained such places was passing, and many believed that houses like Chatsworth were simply doomed, relics of a vanished age that no one could afford to keep. Deborah refused to let it die. Over the decades of her stewardship, she threw herself into the saving of Chatsworth with a tireless practical genius that astonished everyone who had once dismissed her as the dim one of the family. She and her husband moved back into the magnificent house and set about making it not a dying relic, but a living, thriving concern, a business as much as a home. She opened it to the public and made the visit a delight, with treasures to see and gardens to wander and good things to eat. She built up the farm shop and the restaurants and all the enterprises that could make the great estate pay its own way. She poured her energy into every detail, from the grand to the humble, with a shrewd eye and an inexhaustible appetite for work. Under her hand, Chatsworth became one of the best loved and most successful stately homes in all of Britain, a model of how such a place might survive into the modern age, visited and adored by millions. She became, in the process, a beloved public figure in her own right, the duchess who had saved Chatsworth, famous for her plain good sense, her sharp wit, her unpretentious manner, her passion for her hens and her farm animals amid all the grandeur. And she revealed, late in life, one more family gift, for she too could write, and she produced a series of charming, characterful books about the vast house and the estate, and her own long life, written in a clear, funny, unaffected voice entirely her own, the voice of a thoroughly sensible woman who had seen a good deal and kept her feet on the ground through all of it. The sister her family had teased for being slow and unbookish turned out in the end to be quietly as gifted with a pen as any of them, and far wiser perhaps, in the conduct of an actual life. Her marriage was not without its sorrows, for her clever husband struggled with his own troubles throughout the years, and she bore them with the same steady, uncomplaining capability she brought to everything. She knew grief too, the loss of children in infancy, the deaths over the years of sister after sister, the slow passing of her whole generation, but through it all she remained herself, grounded, humorous, practical, magnificently unimpressed by grandeur and ideology alike, the still point at the centre of the family she had outlived. In her palatial house among the Derbyshire hills she grew old with dignity and good humour, surrounded by the beauty she had preserved, befriended by the great and the famous, and yet never losing the plain, shrewd, country-loving sensibility that had been hers from the start. Deborah was, in the end, the most quietly triumphant of all the women, the one who chose no grand cause and made no great mistake, who simply lived well and worked hard and did real good in the world, saving a great treasure for the nation and raising a family and keeping her head while all around her, for a whole lifetime, her dazzling sisters had lost theirs. There is a lesson in her, set against the others, that the showy virtues, the passion and the conviction and the willingness to give oneself to a mighty cause can lead to catastrophe, while the quiet ones, plain sense and steadiness, and a wish simply to be useful and happy, can build something lasting and fine. She would be the last of them to remain, the keeper of the family's memory, and we will come to her long final solitude before the night is done. But first, let us look at how the girls' lives wound together and apart across their later years, in the vast web of love and quarrel and letters that bound them to the end. For all that the quarrels of the century had scattered them across the world and set some of them at bitter odds, the surviving sisters remained, across their later decades, astonishingly bound to one another, and the chief thread that held them was a lifetime of letters. They were prodigious, compulsive, brilliant letter writers, all of them, and down the long years they kept up among themselves a vast and ceaseless correspondence, writing to one another almost daily, in the private language and the silly nicknames of their childhood, sharing news and gossip and jokes and grief, quarrelling and making up, teasing and consoling, keeping the dense, intimate, all-enveloping society of the nursery alive over continents and decades. These letters, gathered up and published long afterwards, form one of the great records of the age, and one of the most extraordinary portraits of a family ever set down, and they reveal, beneath all the famous divisions, a love and a closeness that never died. There is something deeply moving in this, when you consider what divided them. Here were women who had given themselves to communism and to fascism, who had stood on opposite sides of the most terrible conflict in human history, and yet who went on writing to one another in the language of their shared childhood, signing themselves by the old pet names, asking after one another's animals and ailments and children, bound by something older and deeper than ideology. Most of the six, over the years, kept up these warm relations with most of the others. The household feeling, the shared and singular upbringing, proved in the end stronger than almost all the things that had come between them. They had been forged together in that sealed nursery world, and the bond it made was, for nearly all of them, unbreakable, for nearly all of them, but not, as we have seen, for all. The single exception, the one wound that never healed, was the silence between the communist and the fascist. The two of them who had chalked the rival faiths across their childhood floor, and then spent their lives serving them. Between those two, there was no correspondence, no reconciliation, scarcely a word exchanged throughout the better part of 70 years, the bitterness too deep, and the beliefs too terrible to be bridged even by the powerful Mitford bond. They met but once more in all those decades, brought briefly together at the deathbed of their eldest sister, two old women who had loved each other as children, and could not, even at the end, find their way back across the chasm the century had opened between them. It is the dark thread in the bright weave of the family's enduring love, the proof that some divisions are simply too great to mend. The parents did not live to see most of this long aftermath. The father went first, dying in the late 1950s, an old man by then, far from the sure and settled England he had been born into and worn out by all that had overtaken it. The mother outlasted him by a few years, dying in the early 1960s, having outlived her son and seen her daughters carried off to the four corners of the age, bearing each loss in turn with that quiet, unbending steadiness that had been hers from the start. And with her death, the elder generation of the family was gone altogether. The founders departed, and the daughters were left, the surviving 5 and then 4 and then fewer, to carry the whole strange inheritance on alone. For now the thinning began in earnest, the slow attrition of age and illness that comes to every family in the end, and one by one, across the decades that followed, the famous sisters began to die. They had been 6 bright girls in a nursery, they had become 6 of the most talked about women of their century, and now, inevitably, they began to leave the stage, each death the closing of another chapter of an extraordinary story, until at last only one would remain. Let us follow them through that long farewell, the dimming of the dazzling sisters one by one, down to the very last of the Mitford girls. The first of the 6 to go was the eldest, the one who had immortalized them all. Through her last years, Nancy was tormented by the long and painful illness that finally took her born, as she bore everything, with a courage masked by jokes, in her home near Paris, far from the country of her childhood. And it was at her bedside, in those final days, that the one great unhealed rift of the family produced its single brief, sorrowful exception, for the 2 who had not spoken in decades, divided by all the politics of the age, were both drawn to the side of the dying woman they had each loved, and there, for one strange suspended moment, in the shadow of her going, the long silence between them was set aside before it closed once more and forever. She slipped away in the summer of 1973, the first of them to leave, and the wit of the family, the one who had spun all its sorrow into gold, were the first to fall silent. After Nancy's death there came a lull in the family's losses, 2 decades and more in which the remaining sisters grew old in their various ways, the duchess at her great house, the fascist in her unrepentant exile, the rebel in her American battles, the countrywoman in her rural peace. They were no longer the dazzling young Mitford girls of the headlines, but old women now, grandmothers and great-grandmothers, their dramas mostly behind them, their legend already forming around them as a new generation discovered, through the books and the letters, the extraordinary story of the 6. They wrote to one another still, and visited, and quarrelled and made up, and watched the age change around them. Survivors of a vanished age, the last living links to a realm of country houses and certainties that had passed away forever. Then, in the 1990s, the losses resumed. The next to go was the quiet one, the countrywoman, the second of them who had wanted only her animals and her gardens and her peace, and who had lived, in her unobtrusive way, one of the happiest and least troubled lives of any of them. She had outlived the dramas and the divisions, kept clear of the feuds, asked little of the age, and been given, in the end, a long and contented life among the things she loved. She died in the middle of the 1990s, the homely sister, the one the world had mostly overlooked, and there was a quiet rightness in her passing, the gentle close of a gentle life, untroubled to the last by the storms that had torn at her more famous sisters. With her death there were 4 left, and then, very soon, 3, for the rebel sister followed within a couple of years, dying in her adopted America, the communist, the muckraker, the runaway, defiant and funny to the very end. And so the family that had begun as 6 bright girls in an Oxfordshire nursery was reduced, as every family is reduced in the end, to a handful of survivors and a great weight of memory. 2 only now remained of the famous 6, the unrepentant fascist in her Paris exile, and the youngest, the duchess, in her great English house, the one who had kept clear of it all and outlived almost everyone. Let us see out the last of that older generation, and then turn to the very last of the Mitford girls. Let us come to the death of Diana, and then to the long final solitude of Deborah. Diana lived the longest of that older group, dying only at the very end, having reached a great age. still beautiful in old age, still charming, still entirely unrepentant. She had spent the long decades after the war mostly in France, in a comfortable exile among a circle of the disgraced and the nostalgic, the friend of others who had been on the wrong side of history and felt no shame about it, unwelcome in much of respectable English society, regarded by many of her countrymen with a loathing that never faded. Much of the British public, she remained, to the end of her life, the most hated woman in England, the beautiful aristocrat who had befriended the architects of genocide and never once said sorry, and she bore that hatred with the same serene composure she brought to everything, untouched, unmoved, certain to the last that she had nothing to apologize for. For that was the unyielding centre of her, the thing that set her apart even from the others who had been seduced by the dark faiths of the 30s. The full horror of what the regime she had loved had done was laid bare to the whole world within her own lifetime. The camps, the murdered millions, the vast machinery of deliberate slaughter, and confronted with it, she did not flinch or recant or fall silent. She made light of it, explained it away, defended the indefensible, and clung to her affection for the monsters she had known with a loyalty that, in the face of such truths, becomes something close to monstrous itself. She was, by all accounts, a delightful companion, witty and warm and kind to those she loved, and she was also, to her dying day, an apologist for one of the greatest crimes in the history of the world. Both things were true of her at once, and the holding of both in mind at the same time is, perhaps, the hardest thing her story asks of us. She died in Paris in the summer of 2003, in her early 90s, the last but one of the women, and her death closed the book on the most troubling chapter of the entire family's history. Of the two sisters who had given their hearts to the German darkness, one had been destroyed by it young, broken in body and mind and dead at 33. The other had survived it untouched, living on in beauty and charm and comfort, for 60 more years, never paying any visible price, never feeling, so far as anyone could tell, a moment's genuine remorse. There is no neat moral in that contrast, no satisfying justice. There is only the strange, hard truth of it, that the wages of such choices are not always paid in any form that we can see, and that a person may serve great evil and yet die old and serene in a beautiful city, surrounded by friends. What are we to do with Diana, in the end? We cannot admire her, for all her courage and constancy and charm, because the use she made of those fine qualities was so terrible. We cannot quite hate her, perhaps, for she was human, and loved, and was loved, and her gifts were real. But we can learn from her, and the lesson is a sobering one, that charm is not goodness, that loyalty is not virtue, that constancy in a wicked cause is worse, not better, than inconstancy, and that the capacity to look away from evil, to explain it and excuse it, and go on loving those who do it, is one of the most dangerous capacities the human heart possesses. Diana had every gift, but the gift of seeing herself truly, and the lack of that one gift turned all the others to ruin. Let us leave her now to history's hard judgment, and turn, with some relief, to the last and gentlest of the women, the one who outlived them all, and whose long final years closed the whole great story. Let us come to the last Mitford girl. And so at the last there was only Deborah, the baby of them all, the youngest of the 6, alone now of all that brilliant and terrible company. While her elders had given themselves to the fierce passions and the great disasters of the age, she had asked only to live well and work hard and do a little quiet good, and that modest wisdom had carried her, somehow, past every one of them. Her reward, if reward is the word, was to become the sole survivor, the last living thread back to the whole improbable tale, the one in whom the remembrance of them all now resided. She had laid to rest her parents, her brother, and in the fullness of time each of her sisters, and still she went on into deep old age, the final Mitford girl among the Derbyshire hills she had made her own. By then the legend had grown enormous, and Deborah found herself, in her old age, a kind of national treasure, the last of the famous sisters, sought out for her memories, her wit, her unsentimental good sense, her unbroken connection to a vanished world. She wrote her own memoirs, looking back over the long span of it with the clear, dry, humorous eye that had always been hers, neither glamorizing the household's dark passages, nor pretending they had not happened, simply telling the truth as she had seen it, the youngest and steadiest witness to one of the strangest family stories of the age. She had known everyone, seen everything, outlasted it all, and she bore the weight of being the last, with the same grounded grace she had brought to every other part of her remarkable life. She had her sorrows in those final years, as the very old always do. She had lost her husband. She had lost, over the decades, children and friends without number. And at the very end her own sharp mind began to dim, the clear good sense that had been her great gift slowly clouding as age and illness took their toll. But she remained to the end, beloved, surrounded by her family and the magnificent house she had saved, a figure of real affection to a whole country that had watched the Mitford story unfold across a century and found in Deborah, the survivor, the one it could love without complication, the kind sister, the sensible one, the one who had done no harm and a great deal of good. She died in the autumn of 2014, at the age of 94, the last of the Mitford sisters, and with her passing an era truly ended. For these 6 women had been, among everything else, the last representatives of a whole vanished world, the aristocratic England of country houses and certainties into which they had been born more than a century before, a world that had been dying even as they were children, and was now with the death of the last of them, finally and completely gone. They had lived through the whole convulsion of the 20th century, but been shaped by it and shattered by it, and in some cases had helped to drive it, and now the last of them was gone and the story was complete. She was laid to rest near the vast house she had saved, among the hills she had made her home, the last of the 6 bright girls from the Oxfordshire nursery, and the door closed at last upon the Mitford sisters. It is worth pausing, now that we have followed them all the way to the end, to sit for a moment with the entirety of it, the entire long arc of this one family's journey through its terrible century, before we let the night carry us off to sleep. For their story, strange and singular as it is not only a tale of one peculiar English family, it is a kind of mirror in which we can see, more clearly than almost anywhere else, the great hopes and follies and tragedies of the modern age, all of them played out within the walls of a single household, among sisters who loved one another. Let us reflect gently on what we are to make of them, these 6 remarkable women, before we say good night. It is worth asking before we draw towards sleep why we are still telling this story at all, why the world remains so endlessly fascinated by these 6 sisters, more than a century after the eldest of them was born. For the fascination is real and enduring. The books about them multiply, their own novels and memoirs are read by each new generation, their letters are pored over, their lives dramatized again and again, their faces and their voices and their idiom kept alive in a way granted to very few families in all of history. There is something about the Mitfords that holds us, that draws us back again and again, and it is worth trying, gently, to name it. Part of it, surely, is simply the astonishing shape of the story, the sheer improbability of it. 6 girls, 1 nursery, 1 upbringing, and from it a great novelist, a great hostess and saviour of a palatial house, a famous rebel and reformer, and two women who walked into the very heart of the century's darkness. It is almost too neat, too symbolic, as though some novelist had invented the household to embody the warring forces of the modern age. And yet it was all real, every improbable bit of it, which gives the story a power no invention could match. The Mitfords let us see the great abstractions of history, fascism and communism, and the death of the old order, not as forces in a textbook, but as living human choices made by particular people with particular faces who loved one another and tore one another apart. Part of it, too, is the irresistible texture of their world, the wit and the glamour and the strangeness of it, the private language, the roaring father, the magnificent houses, the whole vanished England they carried with them. They are funny, the Mitfords, even at their darkest. They wrote and spoke with a brilliance and a lightness that makes their company on the page a perpetual delight, and we keep returning to them partly just for the pleasure of it. The sheer entertainment of that sparkling, terrible, unforgettable family. The eldest sister's novels, the rebel's memoirs, the duchess's books, the endless cascade of letters, all of it preserves a voice, a sensibility, a way of being in the age that we find we cannot get enough of, however much we may disapprove of some of the things it was used to say. But beneath the glamour and the wit, the deepest reason we keep telling the story is surely a moral one, though the Mitfords would have hated to hear it put so solemnly. Their lives pose, more starkly than almost any others, the great questions of how human beings come to believe what they believe, how the same soil can grow such different plants, how love and evil can live side by side in a single family and a single heart. They force us to look honestly at the seductions of the great and terrible ideas, to understand how decent, clever, privileged people can give themselves to monstrous causes, and to feel, in our own bones, how thin the line can be between idealism and catastrophe. They are a warning, the Mitfords, as much as they are an entertainment, and we return to them, perhaps, because the warning never stops being needed, and so the fascination endures. And the books keep coming, and each new generation discovers the six sisters anew, and falls under their strange spell. They have become, these particular women, a permanent part of the way we tell the story of their century, the human faces we put upon its hopes and its horrors, and they will be remembered, one suspects, long after many grander and worthier people are forgotten. There is a kind of immortality in that, the immortality the eldest won for them all with her loving, mocking pen, and it is, when you consider how it was earned, a deeply ambiguous one. But it is immortality nonetheless. Let us turn, then, to what we ourselves are finally to make of them, as we draw the evening gently toward its close. What, then, are we finally to make of them, these 6 girls, now that we have followed each of them to the end of her road? It is not a simple thing to say, for they will not be reduced to any tidy verdict, and that, perhaps, is part of their lasting power. We cannot simply admire them, for 2 of them gave their hearts to a great evil, and one of those never repented of it. We cannot simply condemn them, for among them were also real goodness, real talent, real courage spent in worthy causes, and a love between them that survived almost everything the century could throw at it. They are a mixture, as families are, as human beings are, and the honest response to them is not judgment of the whole, but a careful, clear-eyed reckoning with each, holding the wonder and the horror in the mind together, refusing to let either cancel the other out. The deepest mystery they leave us with is the mystery of how they came to be so different, one from another, when they began so much the same. Here is the thing that haunts everyone who studies them. The same parents, the same nursery, the same upbringing, the same private language and shared jokes and country childhood, and out of it came women who scattered themselves to the very ends of human possibility, from the saving of beauty to the service of murder. What makes the difference in the end between the sister who turns her gifts to noble ends and the sister who turns them to evil? Their upbringing does not explain it, for they shared it. Their nature perhaps, their particular temperaments, the accidents of who they happened to love and when, the cause that happened to find them at the hungry moment, all of it played its part, and yet none of it quite accounts for the gulf between them. They remain, in the end, a reminder of the strange, irreducible freedom of the human person, the way each soul, however it is formed, finally chooses its own road. And there is a lesson in the particular shape of their fates, set side by side, though we should hold it lightly. For consider which of them flourished, in the end, and which came to ruin the ones who burned with the passions of the age, who gave themselves to the total causes, who were most certain and most idealistic, and most willing to sacrifice everything for a grand belief. Those were the ones who came, several of them, to catastrophe. And the one who chose no grand cause, who wanted only an ordinary happy life, who kept her balance and her humour and her feet on the ground, that was the one who flourished, who did real lasting service, who saved something beautiful and died old and beloved. It is not a lesson against all conviction, for conviction in a worthy cause is a fine thing, and the rebel's passion for justice did much good in the world. But it is, perhaps, a caution against the intoxication of certainty, against the seduction of the total and the absolute, against the kind of belief that is willing to sacrifice everything, including its own humanity, upon the altar of an idea. Above all, though, what they leave us with is something tenderer than any lesson, and it is the thing I want to leave you with as the night closes in. For beneath all the politics and the horror and the moral reckoning, the Mitfords were, finally, a family, 6 sisters who began as little girls in a warm nursery, loving one another, teasing one another, building together a private sphere of jokes and names and shared delight, before life and history pulled them so terribly apart. And the most moving thing in their entire story is not the fascism or the communism or the fame, but the way that childhood love survived, against all the odds, across all the divisions, so that even sisters who served opposing tyrannies went on writing to one another in the silly language of their youth, went on tending each other in trouble, went on being, beneath everything, the girls from the Oxfordshire nursery. There is something in that almost unbearably poignant, the persistence of human love beneath the great impersonal hatreds of an age, and it is perhaps the truest and most hopeful note their story has to tell us. So let us hold them all in mind together, now as the evening ends, with all their brilliance and all their folly, all their love and all their terrible error, the whole improbable company of them beneath one English sky. They are gone now, everyone, and the world that made them is gone with them, and all that remains is the story, and the strange, sad, glittering cautionary wonder of it. And now the night has come, and it is time at last to let them rest, and to let yourself rest with them. Let us draw the evening gently to its close. Of all the strange symmetries in the family's story, the strangest and most haunting is the one between the two of them, who shared that childhood bedroom and chalked their rival faiths across its floor. For of all the 6, these 2 were the truest believers, the ones who gave themselves most completely and most fanatically to a cause, who staked their whole lives upon an idea and followed it past every ordinary limit of prudence and self-preservation. They were, in their absolute commitment, in their willingness to sacrifice everything for a creed, more like each other than like any of their more moderate, more ironic, more self-protective sisters. The fascist's worshipper and the communist were matched souls, 2 halves of a single fierce temperament, drawn by the same hunger toward opposite ends of the political world. And yet between them lay all the difference in the world, the difference that matters most of all, and it is worth naming plainly even at this late and drowsy hour. For though both were fanatics, though both gave themselves utterly to a total cause, the causes were not the same, and the difference between them is the difference between a faith that sought, however blindly, to lift up the downtrodden, and a faith that sought, with open eyes, to crush and to destroy. The rebel sister's communism led her, for all its grave errors and its terrible blind spots about the crimes committed in its name, to fight for the poor and the persecuted, to spend her life on the side of the oppressed, to do, in the end, real good for others. The other sister's faith led her to the side of the persecutors, to lend her voice and her glamour to a movement of pure cruelty, to stand among the architects of mass murder and call them friends. So the symmetry is real, but it is not a symmetry of worth, and we must not let the elegance of the pattern blind us to the moral chasm at its centre. It will not do to say that the two sisters were simply mirror images, equal and opposite, the one as bad or as good as the other, for that is the great lie that the symmetry tempts us toward, and it is false. Fanaticism in the service of liberation is not the same as fanaticism in the service of tyranny, even if the temperament beneath them looks alike, even if both went too far, even if both made grave mistakes. The ends matter, the cause matters, and between the sister who fought, however imperfectly, for justice, and the sister who served, however charmingly, an evil regime, there is a difference that no neatness of pattern can dissolve. It is a hard thing to hold in the mind, that this combination of symmetry and difference, and it is one of the deepest things the girls have to teach us. They show us, in their matched and opposite extremity, both how alike the fanatical temperament can be throughout the political divide, and how absolutely the moral worth of a life still depends, in the end, on what that temperament is given to. The same fierce heart, the same hunger for a cause, the same willingness to sacrifice all, can build or can destroy, can serve the light or serve the dark, and the choosing of which makes all the difference there is. The two of them who chalked their faiths across a nursery floor lived out that truth to its very end. One of them broken young by the cruelty she had served, the other laughing and fighting into ripe old age in the cause of justice, and the distance between their fates is the measure of the thing they chose. Through Suffolk. Musso. Let that be the last hard thought of our long evening, and let us hold it gently, without bitterness, as we turn towards sleep. The sisters were what they were, in all their brilliance and all their folly, and we need neither excuse them nor hate them, only see them clearly, and learn what they have to teach, and feel, beneath it all, that the human pity their strange and tangled story calls forth. They were 6 girls who began together, and were carried to the ends of the earth by the great forces of their age, and they have given us, in their lives, a mirror in which to see those forces more clearly than almost anywhere else. It is a rare gift, however dearly it was bought. Let us be grateful for it, and let us let them rest. There is one more thing the 6 carried with them out of the world, and it is worth dwelling on as the night deepens, for it gives their whole story its elegiac undertone. They were, among everything else they were, the last witnesses to a vanished civilization, the old aristocratic England into which they had been born and which died, slowly and then all at once, across the span of their lives. When the eldest of them was a child, before the First World War, that world still seemed eternal, the great houses full and staffed, the land worked, the old families secure in their ancient places, the whole elaborate hierarchy of rank and deference apparently as fixed as the hills. By the time the last of them died, more than a century later, almost all of it was gone, swept away by war and tax and social revolution, surviving only in fragments, in museum pieces, in the few houses like the one the youngest sister saved, kept alive by ingenuity and tourism as relics of a way of life that no longer existed. The women lived through that long dying and embodied it, and in a sense their story is the story of it. They were raised for a society that was already passing, given the assumptions and the certainties, and the sense of entitlement of a class on the edge of extinction, and then loosed into a century that had no place for any of it. Much of the drama of their lives came precisely from that collision, from being people of the old world flung into the new with all the old confidence and none of the old security. The boldness that carried them to such extremes, the certainty that they had every right to do exactly as they pleased, was the boldness of an aristocracy that no longer quite understood that its day was ending. They were, you might say, the last flowering of a dying tree, brilliant and strange and doomed. And there is in their story the particular poignancy of things that come at the very end of something, the last and most vivid blooms before the long winter. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to grow sentimental about that lost world, to mourn it as a golden age. It was not a golden age. It was a society of profound inequality, of vast privilege resting upon vast poverty, of opportunities lavished upon a tiny few and denied to the many, and the girls themselves, the cleverest of them, chafed bitterly against its injustices, one of them spending her entire life in revolt against it. The passing of that old order was, in the main, a good thing, a movement toward a fairer and more open society, and we should not pretend otherwise out of mere nostalgia for the glamour of it. The magnificent houses were beautiful, and the manners were charming, and the wit was real, but they were bought at a price that we are right no longer to be willing to pay, and yet something was lost in the passing of it too, as something is always lost in any great change, and the girl's story lets us feel that loss even as we acknowledge the gain. There vanished a certain richness of character, perhaps, a certain largeness and eccentricity and confidence, the freedom of people who never doubted their right to be exactly themselves. There vanished a texture of life, a way of talking and being and belonging, that we find in the women so endlessly fascinating precisely because it has gone. They are like dispatches from a country that no longer exists, these 6 women, and part of our fascination with them is the fascination we feel for any lost world, the longing to know what it was really like, to walk for a while through its rooms and hear its voices, before the door closes on it forever. That door has closed now. The age that made the Mitfords is as gone as the Mitfords themselves, and there will never be anything like them again. Never 6 such sisters, raised in such a way, at such a time, loosed upon such a century. The conditions that made them have passed out of the world, and that, in the end, is one more reason we hold on to their story so tightly, because it is irreplaceable, a thing that happened once and can never happen again, a window onto a vanished world and a vanished kind of life, kept open for us by the books and the letters and the long, strange, glittering record of their lives. Let us look through that window a little longer, as the night draws on, and let it carry us gently down towards sleep. It is a curious thing, and worth a moment's wonder, that a family so given to action and passion should have made its most lasting mark with the pen. For in the end, it is words, above all, that have kept the Mitfords alive, their own words, the astonishing river of writing that flowed from this one family across the 20th century. The eldest gave readers her sparkling novels and her elegant histories. The rebel gave it her memoirs and her fearless campaigning journalism. The youngest gave it her wise and funny books about her great house and her life. Even the unrepentant one, in her exile, wrote her memoirs and her reviews, and around and beneath all the published work flowed the endless, brilliant, intimate correspondence between them, thousands upon thousands of letters, gathered up at last into a book that may be the truest portrait of them all, the 6 voices talking and teasing and quarrelling and loving over the decades. No other family, perhaps, has ever documented itself so fully or so well, and it is this, more than anything, that has secured their strange immortality. They wrote themselves into permanence. They left behind a record so rich, so vivid, so irresistibly readable that they can never quite die, but go on talking to us from the page, as alive and funny and infuriating as they ever were in life. The eldest sister understood this instinctively when she turned her family into fiction, fixing them forever in the amber of her prose. The others, in their different ways, did the same, each adding her voice to the great collective self-portrait until the family became, in effect, its own monument, built of words, proof against time in a way that stone and title never are. And the family itself did not end with the death of the last sister, for the lines ran on, into children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, scattered now through the generations and the wider world. The youngest descendants carried something of the old style into new fields, into fashion and art and public life. The others left their own trails of children and grandchildren, some famous, some private, carrying the Mitford blood, and a little of the Mitford strangeness forward into a century the six never saw. The name lives on, and the legend with it, and every so often some new book or film or rediscovery sends the whole fascinating story round again, introducing the six sisters to readers and viewers who were not yet born when the last of them died. So they are not, in the deepest sense, entirely gone. The age that made them is gone, and they themselves are gone, laid to rest in their scattered graves across 2 countries and an ocean. But the voices remain, and the story remains, and the strange, bright, terrible, beloved family goes on living in the imagination of everyone who comes to know them. They wanted, most of them, above all things, not to be dull, not to be forgotten, to be talked about and remembered, and in that, at least, whatever else we may say of them, they triumphed utterly. They will be talked of and remembered for as long as their books are opened and their letters treasured, which is to say, in all likelihood, for a very long time indeed. And now we have followed them almost the whole way, from the nursery toward the grave, from the green Oxfordshire fields to the ends of the earth. We have met them all, the witty one and the quiet one, the beauty and the lost one, the rebel and the steady one, and seen what each of them made of the single century they were given. Before we let the night close gently over their story, though, let us linger a little longer among them, in no hurry now, drifting through a few last corners of their world that we have passed too quickly, the men they loved and married, the fame that followed them everywhere, the people around them, and the houses and the land that held them all. There is time yet, before sleep, for a slow and easy wandering through what remains. Consider, for a moment, the men the women loved, for there is an entire story in them, and they tell us a good deal about the women who chose them. No 2 of the 6 loved alike, and the range of their attachments is as wide as the range of everything else about them, from the gentlest devotion to the most catastrophic. The beauty began with a husband who adored her, a gentle, cultivated, immensely rich young man who could deny her nothing and asked only to make her happy, and she left him cool and unmoved for a man of charisma and ambition and danger, a leader of men, a maker of movements, to whom she gave herself body and soul, and for whose terrible cause she sacrificed everything. The contrast between her 2 men is the contrast of her whole life. She turned from the one who offered her ease and safety toward the one who offered her a cause to burn for, and the burning consumed her decency, along with everything else. The eldest's loves were unluckier and sadder. She married, on the rebound from an early and hopeless attachment, a charming, feckless, unfaithful man who brought her years of unhappiness, and she gave her deepest love, late and in vain, to a foreign soldier who valued her wit and her friendship, but never returned her passion, and who wounded her at the last by marrying another. Her men gave her little but heartache, and yet out of that very heartache she made her art, pouring her unrequited longing into the love stories that made her famous, so that the men who failed her in life became transformed, The making of her on the page. There is a hard justice in that, the disappointed lover taking her revenge and her immortality by writing love better than she was ever able to live it. The rebel loved, first, a young man as wild and idealistic as herself, the dashing cousin with whom she ran away to revolution and exile, and whom the war took from her cruelly young, and then, in her American life, she found a steadier and more lasting love, a principled, clever lawyer who shared her convictions and her humour and her long fight for justice, and with whom she built the second half of her remarkable life. Her men matched her, both of them, partners in rebellion and conviction rather than mere husbands, and in that she was perhaps the most fortunate of the girls in love, finding in her marriages not a cage to escape, but a shared cause to pursue. The quiet countrywoman, for her part, refused a poet who loved her and married a brilliant, difficult man of science, and when that union ended, she found her truest companionship in her later years, in the devoted friendship of another woman with whom she shared the rural peace she had always wanted. And the youngest, the duchess, made the steadiest marriage of them all to a man of her own world, a charming and clever aristocrat who carried his own private troubles throughout the years, troubles she bore beside him with her characteristic loyalty and good sense. Theirs was a marriage, not without its sorrows, but founded on real affection and real partnership, and together they accomplished the great work of her life, the saving of the house, a shared labour that bound them through all the difficult decades. Her marriage, like everything about her, was the least dramatic and the most genuinely successful of all the women, a thing built to last rather than to blaze, and it lasted. Set them all side by side, these marriages and these loves, and you have a kind of map of the human heart in all its variety, devotion and betrayal, passion and steadiness, love that saves and love that destroys, love given wisely, and love given catastrophically. The same 6 girls, raised in the same nursery, to expect the same narrow destiny of a suitable marriage to a suitable man, chose instead this astonishing range of partners and fates, from the gentle Guinness heir to the fascist leader, from the doomed young revolutionary to the steady duke. In their loves, as in everything, they refused the script they had been handed and wrote their own, for better and for worse, and the wreckage and the glory of those choices ran all through their lives. Let us turn now from the men they loved to the fame that pursued them all, the strange condition of being, from girlhood, perpetually watched. There is another thread that runs through all their lives, binding the 6 of them together however far apart they roamed, and that is the strange condition of fame, of being perpetually watched, talked about, written up, that attended them from girlhood to the grave. Almost from the moment the eldest entered society, the Mitford girls were news. The newspapers loved them, their beauty and their wit and their high spirits, and their gift for the outrageous, and followed their every move, their comings out, their marriages, their scandals, their politics, with a breathless attention that never let up across the whole span of their lives. They were among the first families to be famous in the modern way, famous for being themselves, for being interesting, for providing the public with an endless serial of glamour and shock, and they lived their entire lives in the glare of that attention. It was a condition that shaped them, and that they in turn learned to use. They had a genius for it, an instinct for the dramatic gesture and the quotable remark, a flair for performance that made them irresistible copy, and several of them played to the gallery with evident relish, courting the attention they affected to disdain. The fame fed the legend, and the legend fed the fame in a spiral that has never quite stopped turning. Even now, long after the last of them is dead, the books and the films and the articles keep coming, keeping the 6 perpetually before the public eye as they were in life. They became, in a sense, characters, figures in a long-running national drama. their real and complicated humanity flattened, sometimes, into the neat cast of the legend, the witty one, the fascist one, the red one, the duchess. There was a cost to this, as there always is, and it is worth remembering beneath the glamour. To be watched so closely, judged so publicly, reduced so relentlessly to a type, is no easy thing to live with, and the six paid for their fame in privacy and in the freedom to be more than their reputations. The darker chapters of the family's story were played out too in that same merciless glare, the scandals and the imprisonments and the tragedies all unfolding in public, picked over by a fascinated press, so that the household's most private agonies became national entertainment. There is something almost modern in their predicament, these women famous for being themselves, living their whole lives as a kind of public performance, and it gives their story a strange contemporary resonance, for we live now in an age that has made of that condition a universal one. And yet the fame was also, in its way, a gift, or at least it became one, for it is part of what has preserved them, because they were watched and recorded so closely, because everything they did was news and everything they wrote was kept. We know them as we know almost no other family of their age, in the fullest, most intimate, most vivid detail. The very glare that flattened them into types has also, paradoxically, kept them alive in all their three-dimensional complexity, through the vast archive of attention that accumulated around them across a century. They wanted, most of them, to be noticed, to be remembered, to be anything but dull and forgotten, and the world obliged them, watching them all their lives and remembering them long after, granting them the strange immortality of the perpetually observed, so they remain the most watched sisters in history, fixed forever in the bright, unblinking light of public fascination, their every gesture recorded, their every word preserved, their story told and retold, until it has become a permanent part of the way we remember their age. It is a curious fate to be so thoroughly known, so endlessly examined, and it is theirs more completely than almost anyone's. Let us turn now from the women themselves to the people who stood around them, the parents who made them, and the brother they lost, the supporting figures in the great family drama, before we come at last to the houses and the land that held them all. Let us not forget the others. It is easy, in the dazzle of the six girls, to forget the others in the Mitfords, the ones who did not blaze across the headlines, and we should not forget them, for their story is part of the whole, and a poignant one. Think first of the parents, the roaring father and the dreaming mother, and of what it must have been to watch the children they had raised in such love and such certainty scatter to the furthest extremes of a murderous age. They had meant only to bring up their daughters as well-born girls of their class had always been brought up, safe and settled and sure of their place. And instead they found themselves the bewildered parents of a fascist, a Hitler worshipper, a runaway communist, a satirist who mocked them all, watching helplessly as their family tore itself apart along the great fault line of the century. No upbringing they could have imagined had prepared them for that, and it broke them, in the end, the father into baffled, lonely decline, the mother into ever deeper remoteness, their long marriage itself a casualty of the divisions among their children. The mother's part, in particular, deserves a moment's pity. It was upon her, in the end, that the heaviest of the household's private burdens came to rest, the quiet, year-upon-year labour of tending a child who would never recover, a duty she took up without a word of complaint and carried faithfully to its sorrowful close. There is something almost unbearable in the thought of it, the reserved and undemonstrative woman whom her daughters had sometimes found so cool, spending the last devoted strength of her life upon the most stricken of her children, asking nothing, complaining of nothing, simply doing what had to be done with the same quiet composure she had always shown. Whatever her coldness had cost her daughters in their childhood, she repaid it, at the end, with a steadfast and selfless love that asked for no recognition and received little, and bore the family's heaviest grief on her own quiet shoulders. And then there is the brother, the one boy among the six, who moved through the whole story half seen, loved by everyone and wholly understood perhaps by none. There was always something elusive about him, something unresolved, a promise that never quite came into focus before it was lost. We have already followed him to his lonely end in the Eastern War. What lingers here is the mystery of the man himself, the sense of a life broken off in the middle of its sentence, of gifts that were never given time to ripen. We will never know what he might have become, this shadowy, gracious figure, and that not knowing is its own kind of grief, the grief of all the unfinished lives the age cut short. Of the whole family he is the hardest to bring into focus, and the gentlest to hold in the memory. His loss fell upon the family with a weight that none of their political quarrels could match, for he was the one they had all loved without complication, the still centre around whom the warring sisters revolved, and his death united them in a grief that crossed every division. It is a measure of how deep that grief ran that the sisters spoke of him ever after, with a tenderness they reserved for almost no one else, the lost brother, the golden boy, the one whose absence left a hole in the household that was never filled. In a story so full of strong, vivid, larger-than-life women, he remains a gentler, sadder, more mysterious presence, the boy at the edge of the picture, half in shadow, gone too soon to leave more than a beautiful and unfinished impression. These then were the others, the supporting figures in the unfolding drama, the parents and the brother, and they remind us that the famous Mitford story was, beneath the glamour and the scandal, a family story, with all of a family's ordinary loves and losses and sorrows. The girls did not blaze across their century in isolation. They were held, all their lives, within the web of family, the parents who made them and grieved over them, the brother they loved and lost, the whole tangle of blood and affection and obligation that no amount of ideology could quite dissolve. It is good to remember them, the quieter ones, the ones the legend tends to forget, for they were the ground out of which the girls grew, and the Mitfords that, for all its terrible divisions, remained a family to the end. Let us turn now to the brilliant society that gathered around them, the friends and the famous names who filled their lives, before we come home at last to the houses and the land. One of the most remarkable things about the six is the company they kept, the sheer density of famous and gifted people who moved through their lives, for they sat, all of them, near the very centre of the brilliant world of their age, and the cast of characters around them reads like a roll call of the 20th century. In their youth, the elder sisters moved among the writers and artists and wits of fashionable London, and they counted among their intimates some of the finest talents of the day. The great comic novelist of their generation adored the beautiful third sister, dedicated a book to her, and drew, like the eldest herself, upon the whole Mitford world for his own sharp social comedies. The beloved poet of English place and melancholy fell in love with the quiet countrywoman, and asked her, more than once, to marry him. The women were painted by great painters, photographed by great photographers, written about by celebrated writers, woven into the cultural fabric of their century at every turn. Nor were their connections only artistic. Through blood and marriage the family was tied to the very heart of the political establishment they so often scandalized. The runaway communist sister married into a family connected to the wartime Prime Minister himself. The youngest married into a family connected to another Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister who led the nation through its darkest hour was, by these tangled bonds of kinship, drawn personally into the family's wartime dramas, intervening at one painful moment in the fate of the imprisoned fascist sister to whom he was distantly related. The Mitfords were never far from power, however far they strayed from respectability, and the famous names of their age in politics and letters and art alike recur all through their story. Friends and relations and adversaries woven into the fabric of their lives. This is part of what gives their story its extraordinary reach, the way it touches, through these connections, so much of the larger history of the century. To follow the women is to be led, by one thread or another, into almost every great drama of their age. The brilliant bohemian London of the 20s, the dark politics of the 30s, the war, the post-war remaking of the world, the long decline of the old aristocracy. And at every turn there are famous faces, celebrated names, figures we know from 100 other histories crossing the girl's path. They were not bystanders to their century. They stood by birth and talent and sheer force of personality, near the centre of it, and the brilliant crowd that surrounded them is part of the reason their story has such richness and such scope. And yet, for all the famous company, the deepest circle of the 6 lives was always one another. The friends came and went, the names drifted in and out, the brilliant world turned and changed, but the 6 of them remained, bound by the fierce private intimacy of their shared childhood, closer to one another, in the end, than to any of the celebrated friends who filled their days. That dazzling circle was the glittering surface of their lives. The sisterhood was the bedrock beneath. However many famous names they gathered around them, however dazzling the company they kept, they returned always, in their letters and their hearts, to the small closed society of the nursery, to the private language and the old jokes and the bond that no outsider, however celebrated, could ever fully enter. So picture them at the centre of it all, the 6 sisters in the bright crowded realm of their century, surrounded by the gifted and the celebrated and the powerful, painted and photographed and written about, woven into every drama of their age, and yet, at the core of it, still and always just the 6 of them, the girls from the Oxfordshire nursery, holding to one another across all the dazzle and all the years. It is a fitting last image of them in the wider world, before we leave that world behind and come home, at the close of our evening, to the quiet places where it all began and ended, to the houses and the fields and the slow green river that held the whole of their long story. Let us go home now, to the land. In the end, when the people are gone, it is the places that remain, and the dwellings of the Mitford story are characters in it, as surely as the 6 themselves, the still, enduring stage on which the whole drama played. Think of them again, now, as the night deepens, the warm old manor where the children spent their happiest years, and the plainer, colder one their father built later, and they never loved so well. Think of the lonely island in the northern seas to which the old man withdrew at the very end of his life, to live out his last years among the wind and the salt water. And think of the vast and palatial seat among the Derbyshire hills, that the youngest of them saved, the grandest of all their homes, filled with treasures and ringed by its celebrated gardens and its wide green park. These settings held them, shaped them, witnessed them, and several of them endure still, long after the women who lived in them are gone. The magnificent house in Derbyshire thrives, saved and rebuilt by the youngest's long labour, visited and loved by millions, a living monument to the one Mitford who chose to build rather than to burn. The old manor of their childhood stands yet amid its Oxfordshire fields, in other hands now, but still itself, still beautiful, the river still winding slowly past it, as it wound past the children 100 years ago. The places outlast the people, as they always do, holding the memory of all that happened in them, keeping their long, patient watch over the changing generations, and there is a deep consolation in that, in the endurance of the land and the houses beneath the brief turbulence of human lives. There is a particular peace, too, in returning at the end of a story to the places where it began, and feeling the whole great arc of it curve home at last to the quiet ground from which it rose. The women scattered to the ends of the earth, to Paris and to America, to Berlin and to a wartime prison, to triumph and to ruin, and to every extreme the century offered. And yet so many of the threads of the story run home, in the end, to the same green corner of England, to the fields and the river, and the grey stone church where the children once ran wild, and where 4 of the girls now lie at rest. The land gathers them back, the places that made them receive them again at the last, and the slow river that flowed past their childhood flows still, past their graves now, carrying the seasons over them, indifferent and eternal and calm. Let that calm settle over you now, as we come to the close of our evening together. Let the houses rise once more in your mind, warm and lit against the gathering dark, and then let them grow dim and quiet. Let the great rooms empty. Let the lights go out one by one in the windows of the old manor and the great palace and the lonely island house. Let the land settle into the deep blue stillness of the English night, the fields silvered under the moon, the river murmuring softly in the dark, the old church keeping its quiet watch over the sleeping graves. The story is told, the places are at peace, and it is time, now, for you to be at peace as well, to let go of the long day and the long history alike, and to sink down gently into rest. Let us make our way, slowly now, into the last quiet of the night. Let me take you before we sleep to the place where so much of this story comes quietly to rest. In a fold of the Oxfordshire countryside, among the green fields and the slow brown river of the sisters' childhood, there stands a small grey village church, very old, very plain, the kind of country church that has stood among English fields for many hundreds of years and seen whole worlds come and go. And in its churchyard, beneath the long grass and the leaning stones among the graves of villagers and farmers and the ordinary dead of a country parish, 4 of the 6 lie buried close together, home at last in the very ground where they ran wild as children. The witty one is there, beneath the stone marked with her small carved emblem, and the quiet countrywoman, and the beauty who served the darkness, and the lost one, the broken one, who was carried home so gently across a continent at war. 4 sisters, side by side, under the wide and changeable English sky. It is a peaceful place, and a fitting one, for whatever they became, however far they roamed, whatever causes claimed them, and whatever divisions tore them apart, they began here, in this green corner of England, as little girls together, and here, in the end, the most of them returned. The river they knew as children still winds slowly through the water meadows nearby, the same river, the same fields, the same grey stone and dripping woods that we glimpsed at the very beginning of our evening, when we climbed the stairs toward a noisy nursery more than 100 years ago. The age they were born into has vanished utterly. The great convulsions they lived through have passed into history, and yet the fields remain, and the river remains, and the small grey church remains, keeping its quiet watch over the 6 who came home to it at the last. Stand there a moment, in the imagination, in the soft grey light of an English afternoon, and feel the deep peace of the place settle over you. The wind moves in the long grass, the rooks call from the elms, the river murmurs somewhere beyond the wall, and the 4 sisters lie quiet beneath their stones, their quarrels stilled now, their passions cooled, their long and turbulent journeys ended, gathered back at last into the gentle ground that first received them as children. Whatever they did, whatever they believed, however the world judges them, they are past all of it now, beyond praise and blame alike, returned to the simple democracy of the grave, where the fascist and the countrywoman and the novelist lie side by side in the same green earth, sisters again as they were in the beginning. There is a great calm in that thought, and I want you to let it carry you now, as the evening closes and sleep draws near. All the striving and the passion and the bitter division of their long lives has come, in the end, to this quiet churchyard among the fields, to rest and silence, and the slow turning of the seasons over their graves. The grand causes that consumed them are spent. The fame and the infamy have faded to a story told on still nights like this one, and the women themselves are at peace, at last in the place where they began, beneath the same sky, in the same earth, home from all their wanderings. Let that peace be yours too now, as we begin the last gentle descent of our evening together, down toward the warmth and the dark and the rest that waits for you. Let your mind drift now, gently, back through the long story we have travelled together, not to think about it, not to hold on to any of it, but simply to let the images rise and fade as you sink toward sleep, the way scenes drift through the mind in the moments before dreaming. Let the great country house rise up again in the soft grey rain, its windows warm against the wet afternoon, smoke curling from its chimneys into the low English sky. Let the noisy nursery form around you, high under the roof, full of children and wood smoke and the smell of crayons and damp dog, 6 girls and a boy at their endless games. Let the warm cupboard appear, where the girls gathered to talk and plot and laugh in their secret language, wrapped in the fierce close intimacy of their private world. These were the beginnings, and they were, for all that came after, happy ones. Let the scenes drift on and the children grow. See the eldest dancing through the bright reckless parties of a vanished London, witty and unhappy and sharp as a blade. See the beauty at the height of her golden youth, before the shadow fell. See the rebel slipping away toward her revolution, the lost one waiting at her dictator's table, the quiet one among her chickens and her gardens, the youngest watching it all with her clear and steady eye. Let them scatter in your drifting mind to the ends of their century, to Paris and to America, to a prison cell and a vast house and a foreign war, each following the road that was somehow, mysteriously hers. There is no need to weigh any of it now, no need to judge or understand. Only let the figures move through the soft, dim light of memory and imagination, growing fainter as they go. Let the later scenes rise and fade in their turn, gentler now, quieter, the eldest in her Paris apartment, turning all her sorrow into the books that made her immortal, the rebel in her American kitchen, laughing at the world even as she fought it, the youngest in her great saved house among the green hills, walking among her treasures and her farm animals content, and the letters, always the letters, flowing back and forth between them across all the miles and all the years, keeping the old childhood world alive in its silly private language until the very end. See them grow old, the dazzling sisters. See them grey and soften and slow. See them one by one lie down at last to their rest, until only the youngest remains, and then she too is gone, and the story is complete, and the quiet closes over all of them. And now let even those gentle images begin to dissolve, to grow soft and indistinct, to drift apart like mist in the first light of morning. You do not need to hold on to them. You do not need to remember any of it. The story has been told. The girls are at peace. The long evening is nearly done. Let the palatial house grow dim and fade. Let the river run quiet. Let the small grey church and its 4 graves sink gently into the dark. Let it all go, slowly, softly, the whole glittering, tragic, wonderful story, releasing you, letting you down, easing you toward the warm and waiting dark where there are no stories and no centuries and no sorrows, only rest. You have travelled a long way tonight. It is almost time to sleep. So let everything grow quiet now, and let me speak more softly, for there is nothing left to tell, and the only task remaining is to let you down gently into sleep. Feel the weight of your own body now, wherever you are lying, and let it grow heavier, sinking down into the bed beneath you, held and supported, asking nothing of you any more. Let your shoulders soften and drop. Let the small tightness around your eyes and your jaw melt away. Let your hands lie open and still. Let the long day, with all its cares and its small unfinished worries, loosen its grip on you, finger by finger, and drift away into the dark, no longer yours to carry, not tonight. Let your breathing slow, all on its own, without your having to do anything at all. Feel it deepen and lengthen, each breath a little slower than the last, each one carrying you a little further down, a little further away from the waking world, ever nearer to rest. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. The story has been told. The women are at their rest. The houses are dark and quiet. The river runs softly through the sleeping fields, and you may let go now, completely, of everything, and simply be here, warm and safe and still, in the deep blue quiet of the night. If your mind wanders as minds do, let it wander gently, and do not follow it. Let the thoughts drift past like clouds, like the dim figures of a half-remembered story, rising and fading, none of them needing your attention, none of them able to keep you from your rest. You are sinking now, slowly and easily, like something settling softly to the bottom of a deep, still pool, down through the soft layers of the evening, down toward the warm dark waiting at the bottom, where there is nothing but peace and stillness, and the soft, untroubled hush. Let yourself go down to meet it. There is no hurry. There is only the slow, sweet, certain descent into sleep. And as you sink, let the last images of our long evening grow soft and dim and far away, the 6 girls and their century, the great houses and the green fields, the whole strange glittering story fading now into the gentle dimness, like a book closing, like a light going out in a distant window, like a voice growing quiet at the end of a long tale told beside a warm fire. You have come a long way tonight, through a whole century, through 6 remarkable lives, all the way home at last, to this quiet room, and this snug bed, and this peaceful moment. And now there is only one thing left, before I leave you to your rest. Before you slip away entirely, let me say one last gentle thing, and then I will leave you to the dark. Everything we have wandered through tonight was real, drawn from the rich record these sisters left behind them, the books they wrote and the thousands of letters they kept, and all that has been gathered and remembered of their extraordinary lives, shaped here into a story to carry you down into sleep. If the few hours we have spent together this evening have brought you any comfort, then know that there will always be another such night waiting here whenever sleep is hard to find, another slow passage into some far-off time and place, and nothing at all that you need do to claim it. There is nothing to decide now, nothing to hold on to, nothing to carry with you into the dark. All of that can wait for the morning. For now there is only sleep. So let go of the last of it now, the story and the day and the waking world alike, and let yourself drift down into the warm and waiting dark. You are safe. You are at peace. The long tale is told, and the night is yours, and there is nothing left for you to do but rest. Let the quiet close over you, soft and deep and kind, and let it carry you the last of the way, down past the edge of waking, down into the deep still country of sleep, where the 6 sisters and their vanished world will trouble you no more, and where you may lay down at last every weight you have carried into this night. Rest now, sleep deeply, let the dark be gentle, and the sleep come. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.